Lord of Mysteries, the Fool Brother is a Witch. By Tuozhang de Yizhe. Chapter 76-100. Chapter 76, An Offline Meeting. After bidding farewell to Azek and waiting until his back was out of sight, Eve turned her head and said, "Come on, I'll take you to a gathering." There really is a gathering. Klein had thought this was just an excuse Eve made to refuse Mr. Azek. He thought for a moment and asked in a low voice, "A Beander gathering?" Eve nodded, looked left and right, then leaned close to Klein's ear and whispered mysteriously, "Miss Justice will be there too." Miss Justice. A feeling of resistance and embarrassment immediately rose in Klein's heart. It was already awkward enough pretending to be an evil god above Saphira Castle, now he even had to meet offline. Even if Miss Justice didn't know he was the fool, Klein would still feel embarrassed. Tisk tisk tisk, now you feel embarrassed, Eve shook her head, looking regretful and appreciative. Let's go. You'll have to face it sooner or later. Better to get it over with. Eve put her arm around Klein's back, half pushing him as she spoke. Klein looked down at Eve and nodded stiffly. This was his first time attending a real Beander gathering, and he couldn't back out just because he was embarrassed. When does it start? Klein gestured with the cane in his hand. I only have 2 so'er on me, I need to go home first. If he hadn't thought of buying some bread and lamb on the way home, he might only have 1 so'er. Tonight, I can lend you gold pounds, Eve patted her chest and said generously, remember to write an IOU. Tonight, Klein's mouth twitched. Sure enough, it was still an excuse to refuse Mr. Azek. Do you and Mr. Azek know each other? Klein asked. From his understanding of his old sister, it was very likely that she and Mr. Azek knew each other. Indeed, Eve didn't hide anything and said directly, he could be considered an old friend. Old friend. Klein raised his cane and glanced at the people around them. There weren't many people outside the library right now, and they were all some distance away, but Klein still lowered his voice and said tactfully, "Is Mr. Azek also?" He deliberated for a moment, finally uttering an inappropriate word, "ancient." Yes, Eve nodded. Klein glanced at Eve and silently thought, then Mr. Azek might be more powerful than I imagined, very possibly a demigod or even an angel. But why did Mr. Azek lose his memory? He cast a sidelong glance at Eve, his hand unconsciously clenching and unclenching his cane repeatedly as he asked. I don't know, Eve shook her head with an innocent expression. As expected, yet unexpected, Klein complained inwardly. From his understanding of his old sister, Eve probably knew something, but since it involved a high-level existence, she simply didn't want to tell him. It was the same when Eve taught him hidden history, she was relatively vague when it came to high-level existences. Perhaps she didn't want him to know too much about high-level existences too early, or perhaps she truly couldn't reveal it, but Klein didn't care. After all, in the Beander world, without strength, the more you knew, the faster you died. He didn't want to die from listening to gossip about true gods. Are you still going? Eve pointed to the library and asked. Klein pondered for a moment, then shook his head, saying, I'll go back and write a letter to Mentor Cohen to ask. Benson and Melissa are home today, Klein added. Eve nodded, understood. The young girl left Tingen and, after returning home, immediately went to knock on the door of Saphira Castle. Klein was still on his way home, so Eve was the only one in Saphira Castle. She sat on the bronze chair, leaning back lazily with her eyes closed, waiting. After a while, a human figure was outlined on the bronze chair at the head of the table. You're here, Eve opened her eyes and said, I thought I'd have to wait a long time and was about to take a nap. Because I didn't go to buy bread and lamb, saving a lot of time, Klein silently thought. I'll buy them tomorrow. Klein's fingers lightly tapped the armrest. After carefully considering his words, he spoke, did that, spectator, make me gao oca Beander. Eve nodded, chuckling, he has already left. He has already left. Klein was startled for a moment, then secretly breathed a sigh of relief. After all, an enemy who could create coincidences and hide in the dark was indeed difficult to deal with. Who exactly is he? Klein asked curiously. Now that he had left, the script for Tingen should be over, and since he wasn't in the script, knowing wouldn't matter. A wanted criminal. A wanted criminal. Klein was shocked. Then isn't that very dangerous? Where did he go? Can we report him to the authorities there? Klein immediately asked. If possible, he planned to anonymously have someone report the spectator. It would be difficult to trace him if he wasn't in the same city, and the other party probably wouldn't suspect the Nighthawks of Tingen. This was a feasible plan. Don't worry, Eve waved her hand, signaling Klein to relax, a hint of slyness flashing in her eyes. Leave it to me. Klein pondered for 2 seconds, then nodded. Although he felt that Eve's plan and his own plan would likely be very different. Eve stood up, looked at Klein, and said, "There's one more thing. Today's homework is to write an essay in giant language. The theme is, a letter to Ouroboros." Klein was startled for a moment, then nodded. He definitely wanted to maintain a good relationship with Eve's family in this life, so he naturally had to seize this opportunity. He thought of his family in this life, and a feeling of powerlessness and guilt surged in his heart. Klein didn't know if he had the ability to give Eve this opportunity. Mail it to me when you're done. Eve stood up and waved her hand at Klein. After speaking, Eve left Saphira Castle. The young girl glanced at Rui, who was rarely home. The black cat was pressing a nail file, trimming her nails, with a piece of letter paper spread out in front of her. She sighed inwardly. Always staying out all night, and the one time she's home, it's not for her. Raising a cat with more energy than a husky, but Rui is much smarter than a husky. But she would disdain herself for being stupid. Looking at it this way, it would be better to raise a husky, Eve complained inwardly. The young girl secretly leaned closer and glanced at the letter paper. Dear Rui. I have returned to Backland. Thank you for your care during this time. If possible, I hope to invite you. The final signature was, Sherman. More than Ouroboros' standard, Eve thought silently. Eve knew the young girl named Sherman, a member of the Rose School of Thought, a student of White Rose Mickey. Rui had even lent her camera to her. Night. Klein was hunched over the table, diligently writing his homework. Underneath his letter paper were several written sheets, which were Klein's unsatisfactory drafts. Writing to Ouroboros for the first time, Klein wanted to leave him the best possible impression. Are you done with your homework? A familiar voice suddenly sounded behind him. Klein turned around to see the young girl sitting on his bed, looking at him. No, Klein shook his head, lowering his gaze to hide the emotions in his eyes. Almost. You don't need to be so nervous, Eve comforted him. Ouroboros is a bit slow and has a very good temper. I want to leave him the best possible impression. Klein squeezed the pen in his hand. I know, Eve said. Will you read my letter? Klein asked. After all, it was homework and had to be checked by the teacher. Although Klein wasn't afraid of Eve reading his letter, he still asked. Reading other people's letters is truly impolite, Eve said after 2 seconds of thought. But if you're willing, I can take a look for you. All right, then after I finish writing, you can take a look for me. Klein turned to continue writing, then suddenly realized something and turned back. Has the gathering started? Yes, Eve chuckled. Shall we go? Klein nodded, put down his pen, and thought, just consider it a relaxation. All right, let's go. As soon as she finished speaking, Eve placed her hand on Klein's shoulder. Klein felt his eyes go black, and when he came to, he was already in the living room of Eve's apartment. Miss Eve. A sweet female voice drifted into their ears. Klein instinctively turned his head and saw an exceptionally beautiful young girl approaching. He froze for a moment, then immediately averted his gaze, staring intently at the floor to hide his momentary lapse. Klein subtly glanced up. Audrey's attention was entirely on Eve, and he immediately breathed a sigh of relief, silently wondering, she probably didn't notice me. Eve gave Klein a playful glance and introduced the two of them to each other. Eve took out 3 black cloaks and black iron masks from the bottom of the wardrobe, giving one each to Klein and Audrey, saying as she handed them out, you need to be well disguised. Klein looked at the mask in his hand, momentarily speechless. So you have normal masks, Klein gritted his teeth inwardly. Can we depart, Miss Eve? Audrey asked with a hint of anticipation. Of course. Eve placed one hand on Klein's shoulder and the other on Audrey's shoulder. In an instant, the world seemed to transform into a richly colored oil painting, where reds were more vibrant and blacks were darker. Audrey gazed around, curiosity flowing like a gentle stream in her forest-like eyes. As a young girl new to the Beyonder world, she held beautiful fantasies and curiosity about everything. It's like when Rui took me, traveling. Does Miss Eve also travel? Audrey kept observing the changing environment, and even after the world returned to normal, she still felt a lingering sense of wonder. The young girl looked up and scanned her surroundings, realizing they were in a damp, deserted alley. This alley was behind the Sparrow pub. Klein and Audrey followed Eve for a few minutes and arrived at the pub. Chapter 77, Beyonder Gathering. This clandestine Beyonder gathering was held in the tavern's basement. Including Miss Eve and the two others, a total of 9 people attended the gathering. Everyone wore black cloaks and masks, their faces obscured. The gathering place was somewhat rudimentary. The basement was small, and with 9 people inside, it felt a bit crowded. A few wooden stools and an old sofa were arranged around a long wooden table. One of the table legs was broken and propped up with 2 books. Diagonally behind the sofa was a desk with paper and pens on it. It was already a hot summer day, and even at night, it was still quite warm. In the poorly ventilated basement, it was even more stuffy. Several basins of ice were placed in the room to dissipate the heat. Klein observed without a change in expression. Eve's gaze lingered on the black-haired woman who organized the gathering for 2 seconds before naturally retracting it. Audrey looked around. Everyone attending the gathering wore masks and cloaks and were deliberately hiding themselves, which left Audrey with very little information to discern. She turned to look at Eve, and after seeing the girl nod at her, she took a deep breath, raised her hand, and said, "I want to buy the subsequent formula for Spectator." "I have it," said the man sitting opposite Audrey. "Sequence 8 formula, £480. £480. Klein's pupils contracted, his heart filled with astonishment. Though his expression showed nothing, a tumultuous wave had already risen within him. He thought of the few pounds in his pocket and immediately felt that he shouldn't be here. Are potion formulas really that expensive? Klein's fingers kneaded the edge of his cloak as he pondered, I wonder how much the Seer formula would sell for. Low sequence formulas for various pathways were available on the market and had long since been leaked, so it wouldn't matter even if Klein sold his. Moreover, he had to sell it, otherwise, he couldn't afford anything. The gold pounds in his pocket were all of Klein's savings after deducting living expenses. He had originally thought he wouldn't need to borrow money from his old sister, so he hadn't mentioned it before coming. Eve also hadn't mentioned it, as if she had forgotten. A sequence 8 formula is £480, there might be a premium. Then the price for a sequence 8 formula should be between £400 and £500. Inferring from this, a sequence 9 formula would probably be between £100 and £300. This range is still quite broad, Klein thought to himself. However, he couldn't ask his old sister now, so he could only observe further. Klein sighed inwardly and reached into his pocket, only to suddenly realize that the money in his pocket felt wrong. It was a thick wad, definitely several £100s. He squeezed it uncertainly, and indeed, it was a thick wad. Klein looked up in Eve's direction. Eve seemed to sense it, turned her head back, then turned away again, subtly extending her hand from under her black cloak, making a 6 gesture, and quickly retracting it. Klein paused, then immediately understood. £600. Praise the Chaos Demoness, Klein silently said. Praise the Mirror Angel. £480. Audrey secretly rejoiced. She had brought £500 and immediately wanted to agree, but a soft touch suddenly came from the back of her hand. Someone's fingertip was sliding on the back of her hand. Miss Eve. Miss Eve seems to be writing on the back of my hand. Audrey felt it carefully and quickly deciphered the words Eve was writing. 465. Audrey paused. Eve, tirelessly, wrote, 465, on the back of Audrey's hand again and again. Audrey thought for 2 seconds, then tentatively said, 465. Eve's actions were very discreet, and the man did not realize that Audrey was a novice who knew nothing and had a lot of money. All right. The man nodded. 465 pounds. In the end, both parties completed the transaction at a price of 465 pounds. Audrey, who had obtained the formula, was still a bit dazed. She touched the formula in her hand, then touched the gold pounds she had saved. Miss Eve is so amazing. She actually bought a 480-pound formula for 465 pounds. There really was a premium, Klein sighed inwardly. It was a 15-pound premium, that's 5 weeks of my salary. He continued to observe the transactions, people buying materials, selling materials, buying formulas, selling formulas. Someone was even selling talismans. A talisman with only a 1-month shelf life could sell for 10 pounds. The current transactions held nothing of interest to Klein. He could obtain his potion formulas and materials from the church. What Klein wanted to buy was a Beander item with combat capabilities. A seer had no offensive means, and while the Rosal card and Bernadette card Eve gave him were powerful, they could only serve as trump cards. I'm selling 2 Beander items. One is called the Sailor's Button, which allows the wearer to move freely underwater and also causes a layer of illusory scales to cover the skin to resist damage. The negative effect is extreme thirst while wearing it, and the body's water loss rate will accelerate. The price is 540 pounds. The black-haired woman sitting next to Eve said. The other is called the Lawyer's Glasses, which can enhance the wearer's physical fitness and, to a certain extent, distort the thoughts of enemies within the wearer's line of sight. The negative effect is that the wearer will become very irritable while wearing it, and this emotion will gradually accumulate with prolonged wear. If worn continuously for 2 weeks, it may cause the wearer to lose control. The price is 550 pounds. Lawyer's Glasses, Klein immediately said. The lawyer's glasses perfectly met his requirements. Not only could they enhance his physical fitness, but they could also distort the enemy's thoughts, which would be very useful in combat. The negative effects were also acceptable. Even if there was some premium, Klein would buy them. Moreover, judging by the prices of the 2 Beander items, the price of the lawyer's glasses should be fair. Good. The black-haired woman nodded. Klein and the black-haired woman completed the transaction. He looked at the gold-rimmed square glasses in his hand, hooked the chain on the glasses with his finger, feeling a bit speechless. Such a flashy item was really not his style. He put away the glasses and quietly waited for the gathering to end. The black-haired woman's other Beander item was sold with difficulty. Many Beyonders in Biome were of the Sailor Pathway and didn't need a Sequence 9 Beander item from the Sailor Pathway. Even if they weren't, they were all people who dealt with the sea, mostly sailors or pirates. Freshwater resources are scarce at sea, and accelerated water loss could be fatal. Klein looked around, hesitated for 2 seconds, and raised his hand, saying, I want to sell the Seer formula, 170 pounds. After observing, Klein had already roughly guessed the price of a Sequence 9 formula. It should be between 100 and 200 pounds. After incurring a huge debt of 550 pounds, Klein needed to find a way to pay it back as soon as possible. After Klein made his offer, a somewhat corpulent man raised his hand and said, 150 pounds, I can buy it. All right. Klein nodded. As long as it sold, it was fine. Chapter 78, Mausoleum. After Klein's transaction concluded, no one else raised their hand. The black-haired woman looked left and right, then said to Miss Audrey, you go first. Miss Audrey nodded, stood up, felt the charm and formula she had bought in her pocket, adjusted her cloak, and walked away. About 10 minutes later, the second person also left. Klein observed silently. One person leaving every 10 minutes. 10 minutes was enough to get away from the street where the gathering was held. This was probably to hide the participants' identities and prevent robbery incidents. Eve was the third to leave. When she reached the alley, Miss Audrey had already been waiting there for some time. About half an hour later, Klein arrived in the alley. "Let's go," Eve said, placing her hands on both their shoulders. Instantly, the world once again transformed into a richly colored oil painting, the reds redder, the blacks blacker. When the colors faded, the three had returned to Eve's living room. Eve released their shoulders and looked at the two novice beyonders. Miss Audrey composed herself and said happily to Eve, "Thank you, Miss Eve." "Miss Audrey, there's no need to be so polite," Eve said with a wave of her hand and a smile. "It's already very late. I'll see you back." Miss Audrey nodded and quickly followed Eve to the full-length mirror. Eve raised her hand and made a "please" gesture to Miss Audrey. Miss Audrey turned, walked past Eve to the mirror, and after a cheerful farewell to Eve and Klein, stepped into the mirror. The mirror's surface rippled as Miss Audrey passed through it. After the golden-haired girl left, Eve turned to look at Klein. Klein took off his cloak and mask, placing them on the back of the sofa. He put his top hat back on, reached into his pocket, pulled out all the gold pounds, and gave the remaining 50 pounds, his own 5 pounds, and the 150 pounds earned from selling the formula to Eve. Still owing 395 pounds, Klein calculated in his mind. Currently, his weekly salary was 3 pounds. After his promotion, his weekly salary would increase, allowing him to repay at least 1 pound a week. At that rate, he would take at most 7 years to repay, and at least 4 or 5 years, depending on how much his weekly salary would increase later. What a huge sum, Klein sighed silently in his heart. He remembered the pirate bounty's old sister had once mentioned, but unfortunately, with his current abilities, even with the lawyer's spectacles, it would be difficult to hunt down a pirate. Pirates with bounties all had a certain level of skill. Klein pondered for a while, thinking he could appropriately increase the time he spent acting at the Seer Club to accelerate digestion, get promoted to clown, and gain close combat abilities. Previously, Klein hadn't been very active in acting, as he planned to apply to join the Red Gloves at Sequence 7. If successful, that would be the time for him to come clean with Melissa and Benson, and also the time for him to leave Melissa and Benson. On one side was Eve, on the other were Melissa and Benson. Klein didn't want to let go of either. He could only seek out acting opportunities, slowly moving towards Eve, while also being passively diligent, trying to spend more time with Melissa and Benson and striving to hold on to both of them. Klein lowered his head and pinched his brow, setting aside the thoughts in his mind. He said with some fatigue, "Send me back. Since I transmigrated, I've always been staying up late, waking up at noon every day. Fortunately, Melissa and Benson aren't usually home, so they won't find out. Otherwise, they'd definitely think Blackthorn Security Company is a sweatshop." "No," Eve said, shaking a finger, indicating disagreement. "A sweatshop wouldn't let its employees sleep until noon." Klein thought of his miserable corporate slave life in his previous world and nodded vigorously in agreement, deeply moved. "Ha," Eve yawned, rubbing away a tear from the corner of her eye. "I'll send you back. I'm so sleepy. Usually, by this time, I'm already in my dreams." "Angels wouldn't be like this at all," Klein retorted. "Sometimes I really doubt the authenticity of you being an angel." "Oh, that just means I'm maintaining my humanity very well." A smile appeared on Eve's face. Hearing this, Klein inexplicably thought of Mr. Lenorwusi, who had abandoned his fiancée and almost lost his own life in pursuit of divinity. He closed his eyes, shook off the random thoughts in his head, and was about to step towards the mirror when he suddenly pulled back. "I forgot to write an IOU, and there's also Mr. Azek's matter," Klein thought to himself. Indeed, staying up late makes one's memory decline. If this continues, I won't turn into the captain, will I? Klein pressed down on his top hat, somewhat worried about his hairline. "Will you keep Mr. Azek's appointment?" Klein's brown eyes looked earnestly at Eve. Mr. Azek had been very kind to him, and if possible, he hoped to help Mr. Azek. Eve mused for 2 seconds before saying, "It's not impossible. There's no harm in listening. I'll go with you when the time comes. You decide the time. I'm going too." Klein was stunned. After all, this involved something Mr. Azek didn't want others to know. Then he remembered that Mr. Azek had said, You all, at the time, which also counted as an invitation to him. After 2 seconds of thought, he said, okay. Klein turned around, adjusted his cane. May I borrow some paper and a pen? All right, an IOU. Inside a certain ruin, Eve walked through the ruins as if no one else was there. The people around her seemed not to notice her at all, going about their own business. She had been watching in Zhangwil. After he entered this ruin, she immediately left a mirror clone to accompany Miss Audrey and Klein, while her main body came to the ruin. Eve looked at the ruin and immediately frowned. The ruin appeared to be from the 4th epoch. Eve walked deeper and saw a massive mausoleum within the ruin. Eve's lips curved slightly upward. As expected, this was not Solomon's mausoleum, which meant that in the 4th epoch, another angel had attempted to advance to Black Emperor. Alistair Tudor or Truncest. How impressive, to have kept it hidden until now. Eve looked inside the mausoleum, but her vision was blocked, unable to glimpse its interior. She tentatively attempted spirit world traversal and mirror jumping, but both were blocked from the outside. Bethel. To be able to do this, Eve's first thought was of the King of Angels who wielded the authority of the door. In the world of mysticism, mirrors held the meaning of door, a gateway to another world, but compared to Bethel, Eve's door was somewhat inadequate. If it truly was him, then the owner of this mausoleum was obvious, Alistair Tudor. Getting in would be troublesome, but not impossible. However, Eve turned and walked back. Forcing entry would inevitably alert the angels within the Loan royal family. If Cheek wasn't inside, it wouldn't be worth the effort. She passed through the soldier-guarded passages as if entering an uninhabited realm, arriving behind Ins Zhangwil. Chapter 79 Adam. It will attract him. But, Eve reached out and gently pinched Alger's neck. The play in Tingen has ended, there's no harm in meeting. Or rather, Eve now actually wanted to meet him. Eve felt as though she was facing a dense fog, a fog that concealed the truth, and the hunch in her heart was growing stronger, already showing a faint tendency to disperse the mist. A complex emotion rose in the girl's heart as she lowered her gaze to Alger. The moment Eve pinched him, Alger's body tensed abruptly, and an unspeakable sense of terror surged, sweeping through him. This is a very powerful Beander. He tightly clutched the quill of Alzuhad, yanked at his sleeve, and rapidly wrote on it, a powerful spirit. Eve bent down, her sea-blue eyes looking at the text. Invisible spider silk secretly wrapped around his hands. Alger immediately felt a strong resistance in his hands, unable to move an inch. Alger's pupils constricted, his breathing hitched, and he immediately exerted force, veins bulging on the back of his hands, his pen-holding hand trembling slightly, attempting to break free from the control. With his hands controlled, Alger couldn't open the door, rendering the gatekeeper's most core ability unusable. And in this ruin, the spirits had long since been cleared out. Your Excellency. Alger was about to open his mouth to negotiate with the other party, but his body suddenly stood up, turned around, and placed 008 in the pass into the hands of the exceptionally beautiful woman before him. Demoness. Rose school of thought. Alger immediately pondered countermeasures in his mind. Don't be nervous, Eve put away 008 in the token, then curved her lips and said, I mean no harm. I'll ask you a few questions. Answer me truthfully, and I won't kill you. Alger was controlled by Eve's spider silk and couldn't move on his own. He looked at the demoness before him, opened his mouth, and said, all right. Mr. Alger. Seeing Alger slowly approach the mausoleum, the guard immediately called out. Eve nodded, handed him the pass, and smoothly entered the mausoleum. Controlling the Grade 0 sealed artifact 008 made the Loan royal family highly value Alger, even more than some demigods, but his qualification to enter the ruins and even the mausoleum indicated his deep involvement. This is good, I can get a lot of information. Eve glanced at her doppelganger interrogating Alger in the mirror world, then withdrew her gaze. There were guards both inside and outside the mausoleum, but the main purpose of the guards inside was not to guard the mausoleum but to supervise. If Bethel's seals couldn't stop them, then these guards certainly couldn't. The mausoleum was almost fully repaired, probably only a few more months until it was completely finished. But there were still many people working inside the mausoleum, many of whom had distinct southern continent features. They were likely a part of the large number of missing people from the southern continent. The Loan royal family, having obtained manpower in such a way, naturally had no pity for them. These people had more or less scars on their bodies, perhaps from industrial accidents, or perhaps inflicted by guards. Their eyes were numb as they performed their work, like puppets without independent consciousness. Eve searched for a while but found no trace of Cheek, but Eve was not disappointed. Bethel should know the location of all mausoleums. She could directly converse with Bethel, trading information about the mausoleums. Then, by searching one by one, she was sure to find Cheek. Eve looked around. Instantly, all the people forced to repair the mausoleum were replaced by mirror people, and illusions concealed their inhuman strangeness. In the Chaos Temple on Starry Highlands in the southern continent, Irene was lighting a lamp and handling official documents. Although the Rose School of Thought originated in the northern continent, its influence was greater in the southern continent. After Death's fall, Eve had been gradually encroaching on the faith of Death and Cheek, and later even secretly supported the uprising of the Highland Kingdom, occupying the northwestern part of the southern continent. After the establishment of the Highland Kingdom, even the god of Bound became the recognized orthodox deities of the Highland Kingdom. It was a pity that the god of Bound had been controlled by the Mother Tree of Desire early on, leading to the split of the Rose School of Thought and even giving birth to Saya 922 years ago. This allowed Eve, a latecomer, to rise above and become the orthodox faith of the southern continent. After becoming an orthodox deity in the southern continent, Eve moved the headquarters of the church, the Chaos Temple, to Starry Highlands. Although the northern continent did not recognize the Chaos Demoness as an orthodox deity after colonizing the southern continent, this instead further spread the Chaos Demoness's faith in the southern continent. Finally, under pressure, they did not demolish all of Eve's churches in the southern continent. However, the main reason the Chaos Temple could be preserved was not their great mercy, but because the Highland Kingdom at that time had not been conquered by them. Irene pinched her brows, put down the document, and prepared to rest. Angels do not need sleep, but His Highness told her that maintaining human habits helps preserve humanity, so Irene always maintained her former lifestyle. The girl lifted her foot, about to leave, but suddenly pulled it back. She looked back, and a group of people with vacant eyes appeared in her office. Irene's gaze went to the door, and sure enough, there were more. Their eyes were dull, heads lowered. Even though they had inexplicably moved to a different place, only a few people looked up, showing no reaction. After sending the people away, Eve took out a small mirror. The moment it appeared, cracks immediately emerged on its surface, followed by its silent shattering. After using a mirror body double to eliminate the anti-divination, Eve's figure disappeared from the mausoleum. Returning home, Eve released Alger. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir." Eve nodded slightly, gesturing to Alger, "You may leave." Alger glanced at the unfamiliar surroundings and his expression immediately tightened. This demoness's sequence was higher than he thought. Sequence 3, or, Alger's breath hitched, and he didn't dare to think further. He hesitated for a moment, then gritted his teeth and turned to leave. 008 had already been taken by the other party. No matter what this demoness wanted to do, he couldn't resist. His heart pounded violently as he tried to remain calm, but his steps still quickened. Alger dared not look back. He walked quickly, soon reaching the door. Alger placed his hand on the doorknob, a sense of unreality washing over him. He secretly glanced at Eve behind him. The demoness was smiling as she watched him. For some reason, a strong sense of unease welled up in his heart. Alger gently let go of his hand, unsure whether he should open the door. He secretly glanced again. The demoness was still watching him from behind, as if urging him on. Alger gritted his teeth, exerted force, and opened the door. His heart pounded violently, his body tensed, and he vigilantly looked outside the door, defending against any potential danger. The moment the door opened, no danger occurred. A blond priest stood silently outside the door, his eyes, clear as an infant's, watching Alger. Ince Zangwil stared blankly at the priest in front of him, his body tense, not daring to make a move. He glanced at the demoness behind him out of the corner of his eye, noticing that she was watching them with interest, a hint of playfulness in her smile. He averted his gaze, suppressed the panic in his heart, and was about to step past the blonde priest to leave when he was suddenly overwhelmed by an intense fear, like a raging storm. It was as if the person standing before him wasn't a priest, but a giant dragon. Ince Zangwil's heart suddenly accelerated, beating violently, his pupils dilated, and he stared ahead in terror, his breathing gradually becoming difficult. Bang! A muffled thud suddenly echoed in the room. Ince Zangwil's eyes were wide open as he collapsed onto Eve's floor. His eyes still held a look of horror that would be shocking to an ordinary person. If this had followed normal procedures, it would undoubtedly have been a cold case, a perfectly healthy person scared to death in someone else's home. It truly sounded unimaginable. A black flame appeared on Ince Zangwil's corpse, slowly spreading across his entire body. In the blink of an eye, there was nothing left on the floor, as if Ince Zangwil had never been there. Adam's clear eyes quietly watched Eve. The surrounding environment instantly transformed into a majestic cathedral. Eve allowed Adam to draw her into the Cathedral of Bones, looking up at the 100-meter-tall cross. 2 seconds later, Eve withdrew her gaze and looked at Adam, holding the quill pen in front of her. The young woman didn't speak, but Adam understood her meaning. 100 years ago, Adam's childlike, clear eyes gazed at Eve. I already gave it to you. Eve was silent for 2 seconds, then suddenly scoffed, as expected. 100 years ago, Rosal gave her the conqueror characteristic of the Sauron family. You want to support me? Eve lowered her eyes and asked in a deep voice. Adam neither admitted nor denied it, merely stating in a flat tone, given the current situation, your chances are the greatest, and Adam wore his usual standard smile, you and I come from the same. Adam looked at Eve and said in Chinese, homeland. Eve pressed her lips together, silently looking at Adam. After a long while, Eve lowered her eyes and said with a sigh, you know, I don't crave advancement. After advancing to a king of angels, I no longer had that so-called passion. If it weren't for survival, I wouldn't have continued to advance. Otherwise, I would have become a god in the third epic. Adam smiled, quietly watching Eve. If Medici were still here, I would support him. Eve closed her eyes. 2 seconds later, she opened her sea blue eyes and looked at Adam, but now Eve did not continue, as they both understood. She had no desire for advancement, which was a major reason why Eve had always been able to coexist peacefully with Medici. In the third epic and fourth epic, Eve had always supported Medici in becoming an outer deity. Hunting Cheek was only because their conflict had become irreconcilable. But after Medici's fall, Eve wasn't without thoughts of advancement, otherwise, she wouldn't have accepted that conqueror characteristic and started a war with Rosal. Especially now, with Zhou Mingrui and Aemon vying for the position of mystery, it was even more impossible for her to yield this position to someone else. As a king of angels, one could indeed participate in the battle for mystery, but if one wanted to protect one of them, it would be beyond one's power. I understand. Eve shifted her gaze, no longer looking at Adam. She opened her mouth, hesitated for 2 seconds, then asked, Zhou Mingrui and Aemon. Eve paused, not continuing her sentence. Adam's clear eyes stared at Eve, as if seeing right through her. Earth needs a mystery. Eve remained silent. From that sentence, she already understood that this was Michael's divinity, pure divinity. Her old friend, a pure idealist, whose divinity was salvation. Eve recalled Michael's attitude towards Adam, and an idea sprouted in her mind. The young woman bit her lip and cast it out of her thoughts. Thinking about these things now was meaningless. Why add to her troubles? You were involved in the Loan royal family's affairs, weren't you? Eve shifted her thoughts, focusing on the Loan royal family's conspiracy. After learning some key information, many of her confusions seemed to find answers. When Eve learned that Ince Zangwil's allegiance was to George III, she had already drawn up a list of suspects in her mind, with Adam prominently featured. Adam still wore his smiling expression, silently giving his answer. You didn't connect cheek with the Loan royal family, did you? Eve asked. After all, from every angle, the Rose school of thought was more suitable than the Witch Church. Why didn't George III cooperate with Eve using the conqueror characteristic, but instead chose cheek? Adam did not deny it. You're acting like you're playing both sides, Eve said, which generates a lot of animosity. Adam still wore his eternally standard smile, and said in a calm tone, wait patiently for a while, and you might obtain two characteristics. Eve nodded. She handed the quill pen to Adam. The quill of Alzuhad trembled slightly in Eve's hand, its feathers clinging to Eve's hand as if pleading. Eve watched Adam take the quill of Alzuhad, then, after 2 seconds of silence, softly murmured, 3 characteristics for 1 characteristic. The young woman pinched her brow, feeling a bit tired. She hadn't felt this way in a long time, a true, mental exhaustion. Goodbye. Eve waved at Adam, and without waiting for his response, she left the Cathedral of Bones directly. Backland, Sherwood Borough, Minsk Street. Eve suddenly appeared in her living room. She sat on the sofa, one hand supporting her face, the fingers of her other hand tapping lightly on the armrest, seemingly deep in thought. The sound of a door opening. Ruarui came out of the bedroom and jumped onto Eve's lap. What's wrong? Ruarui asked. I met a friend. Eve looked down at Ruarui, rubbed her head, and said, just feeling a bit emotional. Ruarui voluntarily rubbed her head against Eve's hand. The young woman stroked Ruarui's fur, following her movements, and casually asked, why are you back so late today? A cat was in heat, so I took him to the outskirts to get through his estrus period. After playing the role of a beast tamer, Ruarui had always been the leader of the stray cats and dogs in the city. Although the pet industry was not as developed as in Eve's previous life, the wealthy, nobles, and middle class all liked to keep pets to show off their status, which also led to some stray cats and dogs. These stray cats and dogs could do many things, so even later, when she didn't need to play the role of a beast tamer, Ruarui still acted as their leader. As a leader, she had to take responsibility. Normally, Ruarui would help them survive and manage them, preventing them from conflicting with humans. She would also take stray cats and dogs in heat to places far from human habitation to get through their estrus period, to prevent disturbing the residents. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 81. Long time no see, Eve. Eve ruffled Ruarui's head, placed her on the ground, stood up, stretched, and strolled lazily towards the bedroom. Meow. Ruarui shook her body and immediately followed. A light mist drifted through Sherwood Borough. Through the window, people could be seen relatively clearly, which was considered good weather for Backland. Gentlemen had already gone to work, and several ladies were strolling on the streets with their children. The young girl lying on the bed opened her eyes. Her sea blue eyes were clear and serene, without the confusion and drowsiness of just waking up. Eve turned her head and looked at herself in the mirror, her expression neither joyful nor sorrowful. After a long while, she sat up and got dressed and washed as usual. Ruarui left a long time ago, Eve thought to herself, that's good. She didn't go to the downstairs restaurant for breakfast as she usually did, but instead teleported to a desolate mountain far from human habitation. The young girl took out various colored gems and began to prepare the ritual. Soon, Eve completed the ritual. She took a deep breath and chanted in a low voice. Great door of all doors. Guide of the endless cosmos. Key to all mysterious worlds. As the young girl chanted, the gems in the ritual emitted cracking sounds, and the candlelight flickered slightly before suddenly flaring up. The materials in the ritual emitted rays of light, intertwining with the candlelight to form a vortex. Eve. A familiar yet unfamiliar voice came from the vortex. Long time no see, Eve. The voice revealed a hint of nostalgia and emotion. Eve gazed at the vortex, her lips moving twice. Long time no see, Bethel. What do you need to know from me? Bethel asked. He certainly couldn't believe Eve contacted him just for old time's sake. I will do my best to help you. Eve and Bethel's relationship was not bad, it could even be called good. They had worked together since the Third Epoch, and had been colleagues and friends for several hundred years during the Solomon Empire and United Empire periods. Even after the United Empire disintegrated, and Bethel chose Alice to tutor while Eve chose Truncest, their connection was not severed. Alista's mausoleums, Eve said directly, I want to know the exact locations of Alista's 9 mausoleums. This is truly unexpected. Have the mausoleums been exposed? How did you discover it? Do the 7 deities know? An unexpected gain from tracking Cheek. Eve shook her head. Currently, they probably don't know. It won't matter even if they know, it's already meaningless, Bethel said with a sigh, and after a pause, he told Eve the locations of the 9 mausoleums one by one. Eve smiled, saying nothing, quietly memorizing the locations of the mausoleums. Thank you. The last place named came from the vortex. Eve's eyes moved, and she thanked Bethel. No need to thank me. If possible, come chat with me more often, I haven't communicated with anyone for 100 years. Eve glanced at the vortex, silent for 2 seconds, I understand. I hope we can meet again, Bethel. After her words fell, the young girl stopped the ritual, extinguished the candles one by one, cleaned up the scene, and then left. Back home, Eve glanced at the clock, 2:42 p.m. She wasn't in a hurry to find the remaining 8 mausoleums. From Adam's words, the conqueror characteristic was not yet in Cheek's hands. The Lowen royal family would likely hand the characteristic to Cheek when the mausoleums were completely finished or around the time George III became a god. Even the completion of the nearest mausoleum would still take several months. She sat on the sofa, closing her eyes and waiting for a while, only opening her eyes at 2:59. In the majestic palace, 2 crimson lights surged forth, followed by a man and a woman appearing within the magnificent bronze ancient castle. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool, Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice. Audrey stood up, curtsied, and cheerfully greeted everyone around her. Eve nodded slightly and said with a smile, Good afternoon, Miss Justice. After everyone greeted each other, Audrey sat back down in her chair, entered the spectator state, and watched those around her with calm, unruffled eyes. Seeing this, Alger tried to restrain his body movements, raised his hand, and said, Respected Mr. Fool, I have collected 2 pages of Rosal's diary. I have collected 1 page, Audrey said immediately after Alger. Then, there was no sound to follow. Audrey and Alger both looked at Eve, with a hint of confusion in their eyes. Noticing their gazes, Eve curved her lips, saying nothing. Alger was the first to withdraw his gaze. Judging by the information revealed by Empress, it was impossible for her not to have collected a single page of Rosal's diary. It was highly likely that Empress had already given the diary to Fool before the meeting began. Audrey, however, didn't think so much. She just found it very strange, but she didn't say anything either, obediently withdrawing her gaze. The 2 of them expressed the words they had memorized, forming 3 sheets of paper covered in writing. Klein covertly glanced at Eve. He wasn't surprised by this. With Eve's connections, if she wanted to help him find them, she would have long ago handed Klein the complete collection of Rosal's diary. But clearly, Eve didn't want to disrupt this channel through which members could consistently earn contributions. Klein shook his head inwardly, silently muttering, Actually, I could have pretended not to have read them. While thinking, Klein adjusted his sitting posture to appear more relaxed, and at the same time, carefully monitored his body movements to prevent Miss Justice from noticing anything amiss. He took the diary in his hand and began to read it carefully. April 8th, I stood at the bow of the black throne, spreading my arms, how boring. You won't make my 4 horsemen of the apocalypse like this. April 11th. April 15th, Green has become a bit strange. Is he infected with something? Perhaps I can try to contact Eve and ask. When did Emperor Rosal go on a long voyage? Klein felt a bit confused but showed no expression, continuing to read the next page of the diary. The second page mainly talked about Rosal's changing attitudes towards arranged marriages, with no valuable information. It only made Klein sigh once again. Emperor, where is your integrity? May 21st, the Church of the Artisan God gave me two choices. May 22nd, May 23rd, May 26th, I really enjoy the identity of a savant. A strange thing happened, when is this the acting, that the mysterious Mr. Zaratul mentioned to me. July 13th, holy cow. There's a female ghost in the mirror. Chapter 82, The Transaction. Mysterious Mr. Zaratul, I wonder what relationship this Zaratul has with the Zaratul family, an angel family from the fourth epoch. Klein put down the diary in his hand and mused, it seems I need to check historical records. Emperor Rosal's voyage and that Mr. Zaratul. He nodded slightly to the three, indicating that they could begin their free transactions. Klein decided to speak less, firmly refusing to give old sister a chance to cause trouble. Moreover, to impersonate a deity, he needed to maintain a sense of mystery and detachment. Klein secretly glanced at Eve. Though not every deity was like this. After receiving the fool's message, Audrey pondered for 2 seconds, then raised her hand and said, I want to buy the Sequence 7 formula for the spectator pathway, and also charms, electric shock charms, levitation charms, and exorcism charms. I need all other types of charms, just 1 or 2 of each will do. Of course, I will also buy the method for making charms. Audrey had bought 3 charms at the gathering last night and secretly tried them today, they were very interesting. She was now full of interest in charms and wanted to try other types. It would be even better if she could make them herself. Alger was immediately startled upon hearing, Sequence 7 formula. Even with the acting method, it shouldn't be this fast. The possibility of advancing to Sequence 8 within a week was too small. Alger guessed that Justice was probably buying the formula in advance, but this also indicated that she had already obtained the Sequence 8 formula and materials, and would soon advance with the acting method. He clasped his hands and rested his chin on them, subtly glancing at the Queen. After confirming she had no intention of participating in this transaction, he said in a deep voice, I can tell you the method for making charms. Alger did not request a private conversation. He didn't believe that the Queen, who knew the acting method, wouldn't know how to make charms. This also made Klein breathe a sigh of relief. After all, he knew that the private conversation was just a bluff and didn't actually exist. Perhaps it would become real when Klein further mastered Saphira Castle in the future, but for now, it certainly didn't exist. However, if it were truly requested, Klein wouldn't be afraid. Although he couldn't do it now, he was sure that Eve could achieve such an effect, otherwise, she wouldn't have brought up the idea of a private conversation. Old sister might be unreliable, but she wouldn't trick him on such matters. Charms are essentially prayers for power from a higher existence, using special material carriers and symbols to fix that power, Alger said, choosing his words carefully. The material for making storm pathway charms is white tin, and for the sun pathway, it's gold. Audrey listened quietly, trying to remember every piece of knowledge. When explaining the symbols, Alger thoughtfully conjured paper and a pen, drew the symbols, and handed them to Audrey. That's all I know, Alger said. Audrey held the paper with the symbols and said happily, thank you, Mr. Hanged Man. Finally, Alger added, I don't recommend making charms yourself. The safest objects of prayer are the 7 deities, but wild beyonders generally don't pray to the 7 deities, there's a risk of exposure. Audrey was stunned after hearing this, then became a little troubled. She looked at Alger, then at Eve, hoping that the knowledgeable Beyander could offer some advice. Eve slightly raised her lips and said, any existence that can respond to prayers can serve as a source of power for charms. Any existence that can respond to prayers. Audrey pondered for 2 seconds, then turned to look at the fool at the head of the long bronze table. Respected Mr. Fool, Audrey stood up and respectfully asked, may I pray to you? Klein immediately nodded, indicating his agreement. To ensure his deity persona wasn't exposed, even Klein had tested many things, including but not limited to making charms, responding to prayers and sacrifices, and bestowing gifts. "Thank you, Mr. Fool," Audrey said with a smile, then sat back down, entering her spectator state. Alger frowned, then immediately relaxed. "What compensation should I give you, Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Queen?" Audrey asked. "I haven't revealed any knowledge," Eve said with a smile, waving her hand. "Miss Justice doesn't need to compensate me." Alger pondered for a moment, then turned to Eve and said, "I've obtained all the blood of the Black Abyss demon fish." Eve nodded, raised her hand to request a private conversation, but in reality, she secretly placed a harmless minor curse on Audrey. Sequence 6 of the Sailor Pathway is called Wind Blessed. The main materials are 6 crystallized feathers from a blue shadow falcon, a pair of dragon eye sea eagle eyeballs, and the auxiliary materials are. Alger silently memorized it in his mind, and after ensuring he had written it down, he asked, "How do I give you the Black Abyss demon fish blood?" "Mr. Hanged Man is at sea, isn't he?" Eve said, glancing at Alger's attire. "Find someone to take the materials to the brandy bar at Mills Port in East Balam and hand them to the owner." Alger nodded, simultaneously guessing that the Queen might be in East Balam. He turned to Audrey, restraining his body language, and said, "I need you to help me find 6 crystallized feathers from a blue shadow falcon. Consider it payment for the charm-making method. Of course, the charm-making method I told you is only basic knowledge, not enough to exchange for these materials. I will compensate you later with knowledge, materials, formulas, or anything else you need." Audrey nodded, thinking, "Mr. Hanged Man is truly a good person." Alger resisted the urge to observe the Queen and the Fool, sitting on the bronze chair with a normal expression. He could have chosen not to do so, directly exchanging basic knowledge for materials, but he didn't want to lose credibility at this gathering. Justice, new to Beander, might not understand, but the Queen was an experienced Beander, and the Fool was an even higher existence. How could they not see through it? Audrey looked left and right. No one offered the Spectator Sequence 7 formula, so it seemed there wasn't one. She wasn't disappointed. After all, she was only a Sequence 9 now, and a Sequence 9 with a Sequence 8 formula and materials at that. However, she still opened her mouth, raised her hand, and asked, "I would like to know the names of the subsequent Spectator sequences." "I can answer this question for free. After all, I was the one who led you down this path," Alger said, clasping his hands on the table. Spectator Sequence 7 is called Psychiatrist. I learned this from a member of the Psychology Alchemists. He didn't mention the Sequence 8 name. Audrey, who already had the Sequence 8 formula, knew it. Psychiatrist, Psychology Alchemists. Audrey savored the 2 names, then curiously asked, "Do the Psychology Alchemists have many Spectator formulas?" "I think so." Alger nodded, looking at Audrey. Eve also looked at Audrey. "No," Audrey said, seeing the Hanged Man and the Queen watching her inquisitively, almost losing her spectator state. She immediately waved her hand and explained, "I don't intend to join them." Chapter 83, The Ritual. Upon hearing Audrey's words, both of them withdrew their gazes. Audrey let out a slightly awkward sigh of relief and, as if changing the subject, asked Alger, "Are the materials still to be sent to the same location as last time, Hanged Man?" Alger nodded and said, "Yes." Following this, there was a brief silence above the gray fog. The 3 had completed their transaction, and now it was time for free communication. Audrey spoke first, the lively girl having reigned in her inexplicable awkwardness from earlier. She said, "Fool, your suggestions for examination screening and the separation of government and administrative affairs have received approval from many council members. Perhaps they will truly be implemented in the future, but with the kingdom's efficiency, it will take at least half a year at the fastest." Klein nodded, thinking to himself that he needed to quickly get Benson to study and prepare for the civil service exam. At least half a year. Klein silently calculated in his mind. The examination system should be implemented around the time he advances to Sequence 7. By then, Even if he confessed to Melissa and Benson and they didn't accept him, Melissa and Benson could still maintain their current lifestyle. Klein understood that Melissa and Benson wouldn't accept him just because he provided them with a comfortable life, nor would they continue to use his money if they refused to accept him. Therefore, he had to plan for Melissa and Benson's future. Thinking of this, Klein couldn't help but let out a bitter smile in his heart. "I hope so," Alger said with a hint of sarcasm. Alger paused, then thoughtfully said, "In recent decades, the frequency of activities by various secret organizations has clearly increased. There have even been many new organizations with considerable scale and beyonder powers. Ancient powers are awakening." Eve smiled slightly upon hearing Klein's words. Although she knew Klein was just using vague words to mislead the hanged man, his statement was indeed correct. The girl's gaze swept over the contemplative Alger and Audrey, who had entered spectator state, secretly signaling Klein with her eyes to quickly tell them about his prayer ritual. Although Klein could respond to them without a ritual, it was important to play the part fully, and a ritual was a sign of respect for a deity. Upon receiving Eve's signal, Klein immediately felt as if he were sitting on pins and needles. He couldn't use deep breaths to relieve his tension now, as there was a risk of Miss Justice discovering it. He could only steel himself, quietly deepening the gray fog in front of him so that he couldn't see them. He had already avoided it once, and he couldn't avoid it again this time. Originally, Klein had intended to tell them about the ritual during the last tarot club, but due to his excessive awkwardness and nervousness, he had directly cut off the connection and disbanded the meeting after stating his honorific name. Klein gently tapped the armrest of the bronze chair twice. The sound was not loud but sufficient to attract attention in the quiet old castle. After Audrey and Alger's gazes were directed at him, Klein suppressed the awkwardness in his heart and slowly began to describe the ritual he had designed. The ritual Klein designed combined elements from the luck-transferring ritual and the prayer rituals of the Evernight Goddess and the Chaos Demoness, so he wasn't afraid of Alger and Audrey discovering anything unusual. Eve listened to Klein seriously reciting the menu of the ritual, and couldn't help but curve her lips. Even hearing it a second time, it was still somewhat amusing. Audrey listened to the content of the ritual, paused for a moment, then became somewhat uneasy, even unable to maintain her spectator state. A prayer ritual was used to please a deity, considered a prepayment for receiving a deity's response. She recalled how, a while ago, she had prayed to an inquisitive fool with a "let's try it" mentality and received a response, but she had not yet paid the corresponding price for fool's response. Klein had intended to announce the end of the meeting after finishing the ritual's content, but who knew Audrey suddenly stood up, blocking the words he was about to utter. After Fool finished speaking, Audrey immediately stood up and apologized to Fool. "I am very sorry, Fool, I have not yet made a corresponding contribution for your response. Is there anything I can do for you?" Alger was startled, not expecting that Audrey had already recited Fool's honorific name. Klein restrained his movements, pondering in his heart. When he responded to Audrey at the time, he had also sought help from old sister on the spot. Logically, he shouldn't be the one to claim this reward. Thinking this, Klein looked at Eve and said in a deep voice, "Give the reward to the Empress." Audrey was momentarily stunned, then turned to look at the Empress. A trace of thought flashed in Alger's eyes. He said nothing, secretly observing the two. "Just owe it for now," Eve said, glancing at Klein. Audrey nodded, curtsied, and thanked Fool. "Thank you for your benevolence and generosity." Klein subtly glanced around, confirming that no one else would suddenly stand up, then immediately announced the end of the meeting, cutting off his connection with Audrey and Alger. After sending off Hanged Man and Miss Justice, Klein immediately relaxed, leaning back in the bronze chair and letting out a sigh. He tiredly lifted his eyelids, glanced at Eve, and then let out a long sigh. When will these socially awkward days end? Eve heard Klein's sigh and said seriously, "Why are you sighing?" "The fruit of your own choices, even if it's a bitter gourd, you have to eat it with tears." Klein raised his eyes to look at Eve, then immediately shifted his gaze, turning his face away from her. He hoped Eve would make a fuss like last time to alleviate his embarrassment, but Eve, whether intentionally or unintentionally, was usually informal but today sat neatly in the bronze chair, speaking to him with a serious expression. Actually, you don't have to give Audrey's reward to me. Eve no longer maintained a serious expression, a smile on her face, but her tone was still serious and earnest, her fingers lightly tapping the table. I don't mind. I know. Klein still didn't look at Eve, trying to suppress the embarrassment in his heart, but taking someone else's things without their permission is truly an ungentlemanly act. Klein waited for a while, until he felt it was appropriate, then turned to look at Eve. But as soon as he saw old sister's playful and teasing expression, that sense of embarrassment immediately resurfaced, instantly eroding Klein's will. He once again averted his gaze, feeling somewhat speechless and a hint of gnashing his teeth. Klein suspected old sister was doing it on purpose. No, she was definitely doing it on purpose. Emperor Rosal knew a Mr. Zeratul. Is this Mr. Zeratul connected to the Zeratul family of the fourth epoch? To prevent old sister from continuing to persecute him, Klein immediately posed his question, intending to leave Saphira Castle and get away from old sister as soon as Eve finished answering. This was something Klein couldn't find in historical records, so he could only ask old sister. Fourth epoch history was scarce, and only by relying on church records could a rough picture of the fourth epoch be pieced together. That Mr. Zeratul was a member of the Zeratul family from the fourth epoch, Eve replied. Just as I suspected, Klein thought to himself, and immediately enveloped himself with spirituality, simulating a falling sensation, and left Saphira Castle in front of Eve. Eve looked at the empty bronze chair at the head of the table, then also descended from Saphira Castle, teleporting to Klein's home. As soon as Klein opened the bathroom door, he saw Eve leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, looking at him teasingly. Seeing Klein come out, Eve immediately moved closer. Klein suddenly felt a bad premonition and tried to escape, but found he couldn't move at all. Eve slightly tiptoed, leaned close to Klein's ear, and whispered, "Fool, why are you running away?" The warm breath fanned Klein's ear, followed by a strong sense of shame. It wasn't the first time Klein had pretended to be an evil god, although it was a bit awkward. He had developed some resistance. But being called fool outside of Saphira Castle was a first. Klein's body stiffened, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not daring to move. Eve took 2 steps back, sizing up Klein. Seeing his dazed expression, she reached out and grabbed his shoulders, shaking him twice. Klein, whose body was stiff and mind taut, was suddenly shaken from side to side. He instinctively turned to look at Eve. Klein looked at Eve for 2 seconds, then averted his gaze, a slight hint of displeasure in his eyes. Seeing this, Eve immediately raised her right hand, extended 2 fingers as if taking an oath, and said sincerely, "I'm sorry." The apology came so unexpectedly that Klein's mind went blank for a moment. He then turned to look at Eve. It's okay, I wasn't really angry. As soon as he finished speaking, Eve lowered her hand, and the expression on her face immediately vanished. Klein's mouth twitched, and his expression cracked slightly. He silently took a deep breath, calmed himself, and then changed the subject. "I've finished writing the letter. Do you want me to take a look?" Eve smiled, continuing the conversation from Klein's words. Klein nodded, walked around Eve, and entered his room, taking a letter from his desk drawer. Eve and Ouroboros usually didn't communicate by letter, and when they occasionally did, a single sheet of paper was enough. But Klein took this communication very seriously, so he put the letter in an envelope. The envelope hadn't been sealed yet. Eve pulled the letter out and read it carefully. "Perhaps you already know my name through my sister, but out of politeness, I still need to introduce myself. My name is Zhou Mingrui, also known as Klein Moretti. It's a pleasure to meet you. I sincerely thank you for taking care of and accompanying Eve. I don't know how much my sister has told you about our peculiarities, but you should be able to sense some of it. My sister told me that you met him when he first came to this world. Eve must have been excited when she first arrived in a strange world, but after the initial excitement and passion faded, what remained was loneliness and confusion. That must have been a very painful thing. Thank you for accompanying my sister during that time. I currently live in Tingen, and I might move to Backland in the future. You are always welcome to visit. The final signature was, Zhou Mingrui, who might become family in the future. Eve noticed Klein's address to him as, sister, in the letter. Because it was written language, it was more formal. Normally, when Klein spoke to him, he didn't call her anything, occasionally calling her, sis. The girl picked up the fountain pen Klein had left on the desk, removed the cap with one hand, and holding the letter paper in her palm, used the pen to cross out, currently lives in Tingen, to visit. Remove this sentence to prevent him from coming to find you. Eve handed the letter back to Klein. For some reason, you two cannot meet yet. Let's just be pen pals for now. Write more letters to deepen your relationship. Klein currently did not have the ability to hide the aura of Saphira Castle on him. Although Eve usually helped Klein conceal it, there was still a risk of Ouroboros discovering it. Although she knew Ouroboros most likely wouldn't get involved in this mess, he might expose Klein's information to Eamon, just as he inadvertently revealed to Eamon that Eve knew about the ritual. Therefore, Eve did not plan to let the two meet until Klein could control the aura of Saphira Castle himself. You haven't offended Ouroboros too, have you? Klein was stunned for a moment, then asked in surprise. Eve's lips curled slightly, and she looked up at Klein. What are you thinking? Klein immediately shook his head, laughing awkwardly twice to show his innocence. Although he felt a little disappointed, he still took the letter paper, sat down in the chair, and began to copy it. After copying, Klein put the letter back into the envelope, sealed it with wax, and handed it to Eve. Eve casually placed it into the mirror world. The two had just come down from Saphira Castle, and both had the aura of Saphira Castle on them. After touching the envelope would also be slightly tainted, so Eve decided to send the letter out later in the evening. I'm going to the Seer Club to role-play as a seer, Klein pondered, then I'll go visit Mr. Azek. Do you want to come along? Eve stroked her chin, thinking for 2 seconds, I won't go to the Seer Club with you. Call me when you visit Azek. As soon as Klein finished speaking, Eve waved to him, and her figure disappeared from the room. Eve mentally listed the locations of the 9 mausoleums, preparing to test them out. The real Bethel was already insane. The Bethel who could communicate normally now was actually the insane one. Most of what this mad Bethel said was true, otherwise he wouldn't have gained Rosal's trust, but it might also contain deadly false information. Several locations provided by Bethel were the same as those Eve had locked onto, but to be safe, Eve still performed a mental divination. Although the influence of the outer gods within the barrier was very limited, it was always better to be careful. Eve did not want to end up like Rosal, or become a second Thorna. She did not use her main body to probe, but sent a clone to explore the ruins. This time, her goal was not to find Cheek, but to replace a few people in the ruins. After they entered the mausoleum, they would chant Eve's honorific name, and Eve could then see inside the mausoleum through the prayer light points. Eve replaced 5 or 6 people in each mausoleum. 5 or 6 people were already enough, and too many people were taken from that ruin last night. If there were more, Cheek might discover it. The longer a mirror creature stays in the real world, the more it resembles a real person, and it might even kill a real person to replace them. Therefore, it would take at least some time before the second batch of mirror creatures could be deployed, making it less likely to be exposed. Eve was not in a hurry, she had time. Thinking of the people in the ruins, Eve couldn't help but think of Irene, who was forced to work overtime because of her. The subsequent handling tasks were much more troublesome than Eve taking them out of the mausoleum. To prevent them from being recognized by loyalists of the Loan royal family, Irene had to change their appearances and fabricate sufficiently credible false identities, while also arranging physiological and psychological relief for them, a whole host of such things. The girl shook off all the thoughts in her head and silently cheered for Irene in her heart. However, she had done a good deed this time. She wondered how Irene would react. When they met again, would she wave and call her, Your Highness, while running towards her, like before? Eve was imagining the scene when Irene would see her again when she heard a prayer in her ear. Incarnation of disaster. Ruler of the mirror world. Symbol of joy and pain. I'm already on my way to Hoi University, Klein said, sitting in the carriage. Taking advantage of being alone, he quietly prayed to Eve in the compartment, I'm going to visit Mr. Azek. When are you coming? Coming right away. Eve replied, then turned and teleported near Hoi University, arriving at the roadside to wait for Klein. The summer days darkened slowly, it was only 6 o'clock, and still bright, with some students from Hoi University playing on the streets nearby. Clip-clop, clip-clop. Crisp and hurried hoofbeats, mixed with the sound of turning axles, rushed towards the famous university. The hoofbeats gradually slowed, the sound of rolling wheels grew faint, and the carriage stopped at the roadside. Eve looked at the carriage, and a young man in a black suit, wearing a semi-tall silk top hat, stepped out of the compartment, standing by the road and looking around. Upon seeing Eve, Klein showed a slight smile, quickened his pace, and came to his old sister's side. Let's go, Eve said to Klein beside her. You lead the way. Klein nodded, walking beside Eve to guide her. Most universities in Loan were open plan, and outsiders could enter the school, with no restrictions except for some special places like the library. Eve looked at the students on the Hoi University campus, as if suddenly remembering something, her lips curving slightly with a hint of slyness, and she leaned her head to whisper to Klein, I used to be a teacher too, a history teacher. Klein looked down at Eve, it's a good thing it was a history teacher, if it were some other subject, I'd really worry you'd mislead students. Klein still remembered that in his previous life, Eve had a fondness for history, and her history grades were always excellent, so being a history teacher was no problem, especially since in this life, Eve was truly a person who had walked through history. Eve glanced at Klein, what are you saying? Why do neither of you give your old sister any trust? Hearing this, Klein immediately thought of Ouroboros, whom Eve described as dull and good-tempered. From Eve's description, he didn't seem like someone who would act that way. Klein shook off these thoughts, thinking to himself, I haven't even met him, so it's better not to make assumptions about others. I feel my teaching quality is quite good, Eve said, feeling pleased with herself. Look, have I misled you, my student? I just can't imagine someone who scored only 20-something out of 100 in chemistry teaching chemistry to others, Klein retorted. Eve froze for a moment, then elbowed Klein's arm. You're never going to let that go, are you? You still remember it even now. Klein gave a helpless, bitter smile, his tone tinged with a hint of desolation, how could I forget? Eve's lips parted, but in the end, she said nothing. Silence immediately fell between them. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Ha ha. Klein suddenly laughed twice. Eve was stunned for a moment, then turned to look at Klein, only to see him point a finger and say, 1 point for me. You rascal. I'm not that pessimistic or sad about this matter, Klein said seriously to Eve. I believe we can go back. Maybe we can even take Melissa and Benson to see it. Klein suddenly started brainstorming, going back and forth between the two places. Because they were outside, Klein spoke vaguely, but Eve understood his thoughts. That's not a bad idea. Eve glanced at Klein, then shifted her gaze, a complex emotion flashing in her eyes, but she said in her usual playful tone, all right, you're amazing, you win. You're not mad, are you? Klein turned his head and asked. Am I such a sore loser? Eve didn't want to continue discussing this topic, and fortunately, Klein's timely remark, we're here, let's go in, shifted the conversation away from the somewhat heavy subject. Klein knocked on the door, and a second later, Azek's steady voice came from inside. Please come in. Klein pushed open the door to the room. At this moment, only Azek was inside. Klein and Eve entered Azek's office one after another, and as she entered, Eve closed the door. It's a pleasure to see you again, Miss Eve. Azek then nodded to Klein and said, long time no see, Klein. Would you like black tea or coffee? Black tea, Eve said. Her preference had always been this way, spicy food and mild drinks. She could accept coffee but preferred black tea. I'll have black tea too. Azek brewed 3 cups of black tea, giving one to Klein, one to Eve, and one to himself, then sat on the sofa. He looked at the exceptionally beautiful young lady opposite him, and the familiar feeling reappeared. He opened his mouth and tentatively asked, "Miss Eve, do you have?" Isaac paused for a moment, then continued, "A sister who runs a flower shop." A flower shop. Klein felt a bit confused. He glanced at Eve, thinking that she had done many jobs over the millennia, and perhaps one of them was a flower shop owner. Eve shook her head. "I don't have any sisters." "Is that so?" Isaac was a little disappointed and asked again, "Miss Eve, have you ever met a lady who looks very much like you?" "No." Isaac sighed in his heart. He looked at the two people in front of him, opened his mouth, and slowly said with a hint of sorrow in his tone, "I'm very sorry, Miss Eve, I've lost my composure a bit." "It's fine." Eve watched him, not minding at all. "My memory is incomplete, but the first time I saw Miss Eve, I felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity." "So?" Klein asked, "Mr. Isaac, do you think Miss Eve might have known you before you lost your memory?" Isaac nodded, "And last night I had a dream." He paused for a few seconds, organized his words, and then spoke. "In the dream, I was buying flowers in a flower shop, and the owner of the flower shop was a lady who looked almost exactly like Miss Eve." After he finished, he said with a hint of helplessness, "Perhaps I need to find a seer to interpret the dream." In fact, Klein thought to himself, you have a professional seer right in front of you, and an angel skilled in divination. Immediately, Klein wondered curiously in his heart, was Mr. Isaac deciding to search for his past? He remembered that the last time they met, Isaac had mentioned having this idea, but he was afraid that his special past would bring him danger. A special past. Klein silently speculated in his heart, Mr. Isaac's past should be related to a high-level existence, otherwise old sister wouldn't refuse to tell me. Mr. Isaac probably doesn't know yet that his past is related to a high-level existence. Klein was speculating in his heart. Isaac looked at Klein, his usually gentle tone carrying a hint of apology. "I'm very sorry, Klein, you are a trustworthy gentleman, but I deceived you. My ability to see the disharmony in your destiny is not due to divination." Klein was stunned for a moment, then shook his head to indicate that he didn't mind this small, benevolent lie, and said, "Then what was it because of?" Isaac was silent for 2 seconds, glanced at Eve, and then spoke, "Perhaps there are some special people in this world who are born with magical abilities, and I might be one of them. During the few years I worked as a history teacher, I gradually acquired some magical abilities. I don't know why I have them, and it's these abilities that made me hesitate about whether to search for my past." Isaac paused for a moment, he looked at Eve and Klein opposite him, and continued, "I now have a peaceful and beautiful life. Searching for a past full of unknowns might disrupt my current life, or even bring me danger or even death." After speaking, Isaac smiled helplessly, his tone tinged with a hint of desolation. "I'm afraid of death." This was indeed a difficult decision, and Klein felt sad for his teacher, not knowing how to comfort Mr. Isaac. Eve also showed a timely hint of sympathy, and opened her mouth to say, "Mr. Isaac, you're telling me all this because you still hope to know your past, right?" Klein and Isaac's relationship had always been good, so it was reasonable for him to share such private matters with Klein, but even Isaac had only met twice. Isaac nodded. When he first woke up and lost his memory, he was like someone who had suddenly entered a completely unfamiliar world, without relatives, friends, or even acquaintances, and he felt extremely insecure. Even though he now had his own social circle, with friends, colleagues, and students, he was still full of curiosity and longing for his past. "We will help you keep an eye out for anything that might be related to your past," Eve said. "I wish you good luck, Mr. Isaac." "Thank you." After the three chatted for a while longer, Eve and Klein said goodbye to Isaac. On campus, Eve and Klein walked side by side. Eve looked left and right, and after confirming that no one was around, she patted Klein's shoulder, tilted her head slightly towards Klein, and whispered, "I'll take you back." Klein stopped and looked at Eve, nodding, thinking that it would save him the fare. "There's something I want to ask you," Klein thought for a moment and said, "Is Melissa home?" It was already time for Melissa to get out of school. "No, she went to buy groceries for dinner," Eve replied. Klein nodded, his thumb pressing against his silver-inlaid cane, and said, "Let's go back." Eve placed her hand on Klein's shoulder, and in an instant, the two were back in his bedroom. Klein was a little envious of such teleportation ability. It not only saved him the fare but also made it convenient for escaping. However, he would only gain teleportation ability after advancing to Sequence 7 Magician, and the distance limitation was very significant. Eve let go of his hand and, while doing so, tugged at Klein's sleeve, helping him smooth out the wrinkles in his clothes. Klein was stunned for a moment, his right foot subconsciously retreating half a step, his body half turned, then he immediately reacted, returning to his original posture, glanced at his sleeve, and cleared his throat twice, saying, "I want to help Mr. Azek find his past." He looked at Eve seriously, his eyes fixed on her, wanting to discern something from the girl's expression. If Mr. Azek's matter involved a high-level existence, then he had to know old sister's attitude towards this matter. "Sure," Eve said indifferently, her arms crossed, gazing at Klein, her right index finger tapping her arm repeatedly. "This matter's relation to me is neither big nor small, and even if you were to get involved in the schemes of a high-level existence now, you wouldn't be able to change anything." "What a thing to say," Klein grumbled inwardly, "it's both true and heartbreaking." "My not telling him the truth is also for his consideration." Eve straightened up, clasped her hands behind her back, closed her eyes, and walked back and forth in the room with her head tilted back, seemingly a leader truly contemplating seriously. Letting him recover too many memories all at once isn't a good idea. It is feasible to let him slowly recover his memories through some things related to him. Klein nodded, his right hand clenched into a fist, resting against his chin, tapping it gently, pondering in his mind how to find things related to Mr. Azek's past. What kind of things might be related to Mr. Azek's past? Some antiques from the southern continent might be worth a try, Eve said, stroking her chin. Klein nodded. It seemed Mr. Azek's past was related to the southern continent, or more precisely, the past southern continent, the southern continent from 100 or even 1,000 years ago. Eve looked at Klein, who was deep in thought, took 2 steps forward, and headed towards the dressing mirror. The girl had just taken 2 steps when she suddenly heard Klein say to her, "Take me to Byam tomorrow night." "You're advancing that fast," Eve said with some surprise. "Is it fast? After all, there's the acting method and the core of acting you gave me." Klein was stunned for a moment. He didn't have other references around him and didn't know how fast his digestion speed was. "Very fast. Even with the acting method and the core of acting, your speed is still astonishing. Digesting a Sequence 9 potion in half a month, it seems you are very talented and well suited for the seer pathway," Eve said with a hint of admiration in her tone. Klein was startled. "Is this one of the benefits of transmigration? Then should I wait a while before applying for advancement?" Klein lowered his head in thought. Such astonishing speed might attract suspicion from the church. No need. While it's surprising, it's still within an acceptable range. It can be explained away with an excuse like, "You are a top-tier genius that appears once every 1,000 years." Eve stepped forward, closer to Klein, and looked up to speak. As she spoke, she deliberately elongated the pronunciation of genius, her beautiful sea blue eyes fixed on Klein without blinking. Klein immediately felt his face flush. He turned his head, avoiding Eve's gaze. Although he sometimes fantasized about a transmigrator's halo and occasionally indulged in a little narcissism, such shameless self-praise was truly. Klein struggled to find suitable words in his mind, finally only managing to utter, "Unspeakable." Eve chuckled softly and retreated 2 steps. "You've even figured out the acting method yourself, so it's quite reasonable to figure out an acting core in a short amount of time, isn't it?" Eve said with a matter-of-fact expression and an extremely frank attitude. "Besides, you actually don't need to give any explanation for why you advanced so quickly, other than the acting method. After all, you're just a little newbie who's just entered the Beyonder world. Isn't it normal to be weak and ignorant?" Klein thought for 2 seconds, then nodded in agreement. He was just a seer who had just entered the Beyonder world, what could he possibly know? However, he still felt it necessary to slow down when digesting the Sequence 8 potion. Sequence 8, with its close quarters combat ability, was already enough for him to hunt some weak pirates to pay off his debts. But the examination system would take at least half a year to implement. If he continued at this speed, perhaps I can postpone the confession even further, confessing after Benson becomes a civil servant, otherwise, I really wouldn't be at ease, Klein thought to himself. But if I keep postponing it like this. Klein secretly glanced at Eve, a bitter feeling rising in his heart, making him somewhat uncomfortable. He averted his gaze, not daring to look at Eve. I'll help you find some pirate bounties and bring them to you tomorrow at noon. You can choose your targets and then prepare for the hunt in advance. After all, Seer isn't a pathway good at combat, and I won't be helping then. Eve had been watching Klein. Although he intentionally hid his emotions, in Eve's eyes, those disguises were as easily discernible as a child's make-believe. Seeing Klein in this state, the girl appropriately shifted the topic. Because the Black Cat case had not yet been closed, Lord Sesama had not returned with the people from the cathedral. If Klein applied for a special advancement, he could be directly assessed by Lord Sesama, and the assessment could be completed on the same day. Because Klein performed excellently in the Spawn of Evil God incident, his contributions were sufficient to exchange for materials and the formula. He successfully passed the assessment, but to his surprise and confusion, the church actually intended to conceal knowledge of the acting method. He had secretly revealed knowledge of the acting method to others in the church, but the church did not hold him accountable. It is worth mentioning that Old Neil has returned, and Mr. Dana, who replaced Old Neil, will return to Backland tomorrow. Because of the Black Cat's demonstrated goodwill towards the Nighthawks and its consistent help to ordinary people, without having committed any evil, its danger level decreased once again. If the result remains the same after a month, then Lord Sesama will also return. Additionally, due to this Spawn of Evil God incident, the cathedral decided to increase the Nighthawks' combat strength in Tingen City. New Nighthawks will be assigned to the Tingen Nighthawks squad, and Miss Mei Gao OC might become a member of the Tingen City Nighthawks after being confirmed harmless. Chapter 87. Character Creation. Choose. Eve shoved a stack of papers into Klein's arms. So many. Klein roughly flipped through them. There were wanted posters, newspapers, and what looked like handwritten reports, clearly information from various different sources. He casually pulled out a piece of paper and scanned it. It was a newspaper, and information about potential hunting targets for Klein was highlighted in red pen. At the end of the red line, there was also a large, 200, written in red pen. Klein guessed that it should be the bounty amount. Klein's heart pounded at the sight of the bounty, but fortunately, his rationality quickly suppressed his excitement, allowing him to continue reading. Robert Dickinson, possessing superhuman strength and speed, proficient in various weapons. First mate of the tuna, at least 6 people tortured to death by him, one of whom was a 10-year-old boy. There was also a picture in the newspaper, of the wrecked passenger ship. There were obvious bloodstains and some human limbs on the ship, showing what the passengers on that ship had experienced. If not for the official personnel arriving, perhaps all the passengers on this ship would have perished. Although he had imagined pirates to be like this, facing it directly still made Klein's heart tremble. Klein folded a corner of the newspaper, marking it, preparing to hunt him if he had the chance later. According to the newspaper's description, Robert should be a warrior or a very powerful ordinary person. As a clown, he did not have the ability to hunt Robert Dickinson. Klein continued to pick up the next piece of paper. This was a wanted poster with a pirate's photo printed on it. Above the photo, his name, Liji Barrow, was written in large letters. Below the photo was the bounty, £150, a full £50 less than Robert. Robert's bounty should be very high among Sequence 9 pirates, Klein thought to himself. His frontal combat ability is very strong. On the back of the wanted poster was detailed information about Liji Barrow, skilled in making traps and tracking, with good physical fitness. Klein flipped through them one by one. Marco Bizzo, Jerry Payton, Martin Thane, many of these candidates given by Old Sister were probably Beyonders. Thinking of this, Klein couldn't help but want to complain. If he didn't know the detailed information of most Sequence 9s, it would be really difficult to distinguish Beyonders from ordinary people among these individuals. Even so, Klein still felt that he might have made misjudgments. Most of these pirates' bounties ranged from 50 to 200 pounds, with a few being under 50 pounds, and a couple in the teens. Klein guessed that those under 50 pounds were probably all ordinary people. After a period of picking and choosing, Klein finally settled on a target, Baldy, John Cox. The bounty was 100 pounds, and from the information, he seemed to be a sailor. Klein felt he could try it. Sailors were formidable in water combat but had some limitations on land. After choosing his target, Klein handed the wanted poster to Eve. Eve glanced at it, then put the wanted poster into her bag, and took out a deck of tarot cards from her handbag, handing them to Klein. "These are for you as a weapon," Eve said. Klein took the tarot cards and examined them carefully, finding that they were just an ordinary deck of tarot cards that could be bought anywhere, but the patterns were very beautiful, likely a deluxe edition. The cards were indeed very compatible with the ability of paper for soldiers. Klein placed the ancient silver mirror in his shirt pocket, perfectly covering his heart. He always carried the silver mirror with him. He had accidentally dropped it once during the Spawn of Evil God incident. When Klein retrieved the mirror afterward, he found that the silver mirror was completely unharmed. Later, he even specifically tested it and found that the silver mirror was extremely sturdy. Klein stood in front of the full-length mirror, scrutinizing his reflection, patting his chest, and taking a deep breath to suppress the tension and fear in his heart. Although he had prepared himself mentally, facing it truly still made him nervous and afraid. After all, both Klein and Zhou Mingrui were law-abiding citizens who had never even killed a chicken. The revolver under his armpit needed to be moved to his waist. While hidden, it was inconvenient to draw the gun from his armpit. And his face, it would be best to disguise his face as well. Klein touched his face, thinking of the black iron mask Eve had given him last time. No, if he wore a mask, he wouldn't be able to wear his glasses. Klein remembered his unique appearance that night and really didn't want to repeat. Unique. He savored the word again, chuckling to himself, using self-deprecation to ease his emotions. He touched his cheek, then turned to Eve. "Is there a way to change my appearance?" "Yes, Beyonder items, or illusions, both work." Eve tilted her head, her sea blue eyes fixed on Klein. "What kind of Beyonder item?" Klein asked. "A human skin mask that can change your appearance. If it's you, you can only wear it for an hour, otherwise, it will cause self-cognitive confusion, or even loss of control." "Then let's go with illusion." Klein deliberated before saying, "An hour is too short." "All right then, what kind of face do you want?" "Whatever," Klein said, then paused and immediately added, "It has to be presentable." After all, it was his own face, even if fake. Klein didn't want his face to be ugly to a new extreme. Of course, Eve chuckled, her face beaming with excitement, a hint of mischievousness in the slight curve of her lips. "I'm starting." A bad premonition immediately rose in Klein's heart. Just as he was about to back out, he heard Eve say cheerfully, "Done." Before Eve's words fully faded, Klein immediately turned to look at the full-length mirror. In the mirror, an intellectual beauty, wearing a black lace dress and a pair of red high heels at least 5 centimeters tall, her appearance a fusion of Zhou Mingrui and Klein after a gender swap, stared blankly back at herself. That was Klein himself. Klein felt as if a hammer was fiercely pounding his head. He slowly raised his hands until they were level with his glasses. Looking at those fair, slender hands, Klein wanted to cry but had no tears. He had actually undergone a direct sex change. Why had his clothes changed too? And his height, at least 3 centimeters shorter. Subtracting the height of the high heels, he was 8 centimeters shorter. There were too many things to complain about. Klein was momentarily overwhelmed. After realizing what had happened, Klein glared angrily at Eve, preparing to settle the score, but he almost tripped and fell after taking just one step. Klein immediately steadied himself by grabbing the nearby wall. After standing firm, Klein was visibly stunned. He had thought that illusion was merely a deception of the eyes, but Eve's illusion could actually affect reality. No, to be precise, it shouldn't be affecting reality. Even the King of Angels needs to abide by fundamental rules. If it could affect reality, could illusion still be called illusion? It should be simultaneously deceiving my body, subconscious, or something else. I knew those high heels on my feet were fake, but when I walked, I still felt like I was wearing high heels. To achieve this level is actually no different from interfering with reality. If everyone believes Klein is wearing high heels, and he himself believes he is wearing high heels, then he is wearing high heels. No, what kind of ridiculous analogy is this? Klein immediately shook off those chaotic thoughts from his mind, raised his head, and stared unblinkingly at Eve. Eve pointed to the mirror behind Klein. Klein looked at Eve suspiciously, but 2 seconds later, he still turned his head and looked at the full-length mirror. In the mirror was a young man with black hair and brown eyes, dressed in formal wear. The illusion had been dispelled. Klein looked down, then turned in a circle, confirming he had changed back, then glared at Eve, gritting his teeth and saying, "I'll create it myself." He sat at the desk, closed his eyes, and sketched the image he wanted in his mind. Then, using divination and prayer, he drew it and handed it to Eve. Klein's new appearance was also a fusion of Klein's and Zhou Mingrui's faces, looking like a gender-swapped version of Eve's previous design. The height needs to be changed too, 1.80 m is fine, Klein said, pointing to the drawing. Eve looked at Klein teasingly, "Isn't 1.70 m better, Zhou Mingrui?" "This is for disguise," Klein mumbled, "besides, you still owe me 8 centimeters. Eve shook the drawing in her hand, hummed twice, and didn't continue speaking. "It really is for disguise," Klein complained in his heart. "Where's the most basic trust between people? Have you thought of a name? After all, you'll be frequenting the Sonia Sea with this identity from now on, so it's better to get an identity document sooner rather than later." "Yes," Klein immediately nodded. He had already thought it through. Gehrman Sparrow. Chapter 88. Acquaintance, at work. Gehrman. Eve repeated the name, finding it somewhat familiar. She lowered her head, right hand on her chin, pondering for 2 seconds before hesitantly asking, "The game you're playing?" Klein nodded. "Sparrow. Gehrman Sparrow." Eve murmured a couple of times, then suddenly reacted, "Ha, you truly are a genius at naming, Gehrman." A wave of embarrassment instantly rose from Klein's heart. He raised a hand, wanting to pull down his hat brim to shield his eyes, but then felt it would seem too deliberate. His hand, suspended in midair, instead adjusted his top hat, and his brown eyes stared at the floor as if trying to bore a hole through it. When he was naming, he only thought of playing a prank, not realizing how shameful it would be when an informed person called him out so seriously. "Is it still too late to change the name now?" Klein muttered to himself. Of course, he knew it was impossible. Given Eve's personality, he might even get Gehrman Sparrow's identification papers tonight. Cough, cough, Klein cleared his throat twice, stiffly changing the subject. "Has Ouroboros replied?" He has, Eve chuckled twice, taking a letter from her handbag. "He even specifically found an envelope. Before, the letters he gave me were just on a random piece of paper." Klein's heart stirred, pleasantly surprised by Ouroboros's goodwill towards him. He took the envelope, a very ordinary white one, with no stamp on it. This was normal, as they weren't communicating through conventional means. Klein's letter also had no stamp. The envelope's seal was waxed shut. Klein found a small knife in a drawer, carefully opened the letter, took out the letter paper, and read it carefully. "Dear Zhou Mingrui. Hello. It's a pleasure to meet you. Don't feel constrained, I like you very much. Please take good care of Eve." The signature at the end was, "Your older brother Ouroboros." The content of the letter was sparse, but the final signature clearly indicated that he had accepted him, which made Klein very happy. How is it? Eve asked immediately when she saw Klein put down the letter. "The content is very little, but the signature says, 'Your older brother Ouroboros,'" Klein replied truthfully. Ouroboros always says very little. Eve's mind conjured Ouroboros' daytime-like appearance. Most of the time, the letters he gives me only contain an and he never writes a signature or an opening greeting. Is that so? Klein glanced at the letter in his hand, a slight smile playing on his lips. It seemed Ouroboros valued this exchange as much as he did. Then I'll strive in this direction from now on. Eve put her hands behind her back, took 2 steps closer to Klein, tilted her head slightly to look at him, and chuckled, I wish you early success. After speaking, Eve twisted her feet, turned around, clenched her fists, and raised her right hand high, as if taking an oath, saying, let cold and distant pleasantries disappear from letters. So Chunabu, Klein looked at Eve with a hint of speechlessness, complaining inwardly. Nighttime. As Klein expected, Eve had indeed sorted out German Sparrow's identification papers that very evening, but he didn't need them tonight. Klein touched the revolver at his waist, took a deep breath, suppressing the nervousness in his heart. He looked at himself in the mirror, put on his lawyer's glasses, and immediately a surge of irritable emotion, like a vine, tightly wrapped around Klein's heart. He felt that everything he looked at now was an eyesore, and he even wanted to curse at himself in the mirror. Klein immediately stroked his chest, took a few deep breaths, suppressing the irritable emotions in his heart, trying hard not to let his emotions affect him. I'm ready, Klein turned to Eve and Rui and said. The girl and the cat were looking at Klein seriously, like parents sending their child off to an exam. Good, let's go. Eve, holding the cat in one hand and placing the other on Klein's shoulder, traveled through the spirit world to Rhodes Islands. Although it was deep into the night, pirates did not have good sleeping habits. Several taverns were still brightly lit, and the clamorous sounds from inside could be heard even from outside. A few drunkards were sleeping on the road. Pirates lived extremely unstable lives. Perhaps their heads would be cut off the next day, either to be exchanged for a bounty or to be displayed on a flagpole. Therefore, they all highly advocated living for the moment. Many pirates did not save money, they preferred to squander their wealth on beer and women after disembarking. Klein, dressed in a somewhat old sailor's outfit, without his usual respectable appearance, hid in a relatively secluded, deserted corner, observing the situation at Sparrow Tavern. Even Rui, meanwhile, walked into a tavern, ordered a bottle of beer and 2 steaks, and observed Klein. The appearance of even Rui did not attract anyone's attention. No one in the tavern noticed an exceptionally beautiful young girl walking in. Klein's right hand remained in his pocket, clutching a tarot card. A little sweat broke out in his palm, and his eyes were fixed on the tavern entrance. He felt a heavy weight pressing on his heart, yet his heart was thumping very fast, seemingly unaffected by the weight. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. A bald, strong man, holding an empty wine bottle, staggered out of Sparrow Tavern. Klein immediately held his breath, staring intently at the man. Bald, blue eyes, a scar. He recalled John Cox's appearance from the wanted poster, straining to discern it in the lamplight, confirming that the man was his target. John Cox staggered along. After 2 steps, he put the bottle's mouth into his mouth and slowly tilted his head back, but no wine entered his mouth as usual. John held the bottle in front of his eyes, squinted and observed it for a while before realizing that the bottle was empty. He cursed loudly and smashed the bottle on the ground, but he didn't return to the tavern. Instead, he continued to stagger down the street. Due to his drunkenness, John Cox not only walked very slowly but also constantly got his directions wrong, swaying towards another tavern. Klein saw all of this, and the irritable emotions he had been suppressing immediately surged up, causing him to curse John Cox inwardly. The moment the emotion appeared, Klein immediately tried to suppress it. He took a few deep breaths and barely managed to adjust his state. Klein pondered for 2 seconds, deciding he couldn't wait any longer for John Cox to come to him, otherwise, he might not be able to resist rushing out and confronting John Cox directly. Klein took off his glasses, pulled out 2 tarot cards, tucking them into his left and right sleeves respectively, then pulled up his collar and lowered his head, shrinking his neck. After a simple disguise of his face, Klein walked out and supported John Cox, saying in a fawning tone, "Boss, I'm here to help you." John Cox opened his eyes, looked at Klein, couldn't remember who this kid was. He shook his head, blinked hard twice, and looked at Klein again. "Oh boss, calling me boss." He was just a first mate, there was still a captain above him. Even if he wasn't convinced, he knew it wasn't his place to be called boss. Who knew? Klein immediately acknowledged in a fawning tone, "Yes, yes, boss." This fawning tone made John Cox extremely happy. "Good, good." Klein exerted a little force on his hand and led John Cox away in front of everyone in the tavern. He supported John Cox, walking leisurely down the street, gradually approaching the small alley he had chosen. Klein had already done his homework, having explored the nearby area that afternoon and memorized several suitable locations. The journey went smoothly. No one suspected that the person supporting the drunkard like a friend was about to take the drunkard's head. Even when they encountered an acquaintance of John Cox on the way, they weren't exposed. Gradually, the two entered the alley. Klein's hand secretly reached into his sleeve, his two fingers clamping a tarot card. John Cox suddenly felt a headache. He had been closing his eyes and was almost asleep, but he opened them, looked around. "Idiot, wrong way. You." His voice abruptly stopped. John Cox's mouth hung open, making sounds, looking at Klein in disbelief. With a thump, he fell to the ground. Blood flowed from his neck. Clap, clap, clap. Applause rang out. A splendid hunt. Even Rui walked out of the alley. It was indeed smooth, but not even a single fight occurred. Klein threw the blood-stained tarot card onto the ground, took a deep breath. A strong smell of blood immediately rushed into his nostrils, and Klein immediately held his breath again. A seer is not a pathway skilled in direct combat. Why use your weakness to attack others' strengths? Eve said with a smile. Conspiracy and schemes are also a form of strength. Klein nodded. I know, after all, I prepared so much for a potential battle. Although I hoped it wouldn't happen, I'm still a little disappointed that it didn't. He then asked, "Can I go claim the bounty now?" "No," Eve said. "You can only claim it tomorrow." "Do I really have to cut off his head?" Klein was a bit resistant. This incident today was already a considerable shock to him. If he had to personally cut off someone's head again, he couldn't even imagine it. "You can also take the entire body to claim the bounty," Rui said, licking her fur, "or other evidence that proves the person has been killed and that you killed him." Eve smiled and put John Cox's body into the mirror space. "I'll take you to claim the bounty tomorrow. How about we split it 50-50? Klein nodded, silently calculating in his heart. At this rate, he could pay off his debt very quickly. Chapter 89, The Transfer Student. The next morning, Eve groggily lifted her head, glanced at the clock on the wall, and then her head thumped back onto the pillow. After closing her eyes and dozing for another dozen seconds, Eve finally crawled out of her beloved bed, solving the problems of getting dressed and washing up within a few minutes. After tidying up, Eve pulled back the covers and picked up Rui, who was sleeping soundly on the bed, holding her in her hand and shaking her back and forth twice. Meow. Rui let out a dissatisfied cry, her eyes slowly opening in a daze. Eve chuckled softly, instinctively stroked Rui's small head, placed her in her arms, and walked towards the full-length mirror. Ripples spread across the mirror's surface, and with a single step through it, she was in the familiar room. Seeing Eve emerge from the mirror, Klein's eyes immediately lit up, and he quickly went to greet her. He had been looking forward to this all night. After Eve altered Klein's appearance, she took him directly to the exchange point and efficiently traded John Cox's corpse for the bounty. When he held the 50 pounds in his hand, he felt he had never been so energetic. The fatigue from staying up all night and the discomfort of killing had largely disappeared. Klein pulled out 10 pounds and put away the remaining 40 pounds. Taking out 50 pounds at once would surely scare Melissa and Benson, making them suspect he had done something illegal. "Have you been an adventurer before?" Klein asked casually, remembering Eve's practiced movements. Eve nodded, placed her hand on Klein's shoulder, and teleported back to Klein's home. Are we going again tomorrow night? Eve asked, crossing her arms. Klein thought about his daily routine of staying up late ever since he transmigrated, touched his hair, feeling its thickness, and nodded without hesitation. Eve watched Klein's actions, then glanced at his still safe hairline, stroked her chin, pondered for 2 seconds. How about we postpone the lessons? Currently, Klein was primarily learning various languages that could manipulate mystical powers and knowledge related to low sequence. Klein also received lessons in mystical languages from the Nighthawks. Previously, Mr. Dana taught him, and now it was Mr. Neal. The Nighthawks taught ancient Hermes, while Eve mainly taught giant language. Klein said, I can self-study a part first, and we can start the lessons after I've paid off my debt. Good, Eve nodded. You can also write letters to Ouroboros in giant language, this way you can both foster connection and practice the language. After speaking, Klein pursed his lips, looked at Eve, then lowered his head to stare at the floor, seemingly hesitating before slowly looking up, his brown eyes fixed on Eve. Can you try to get to know Melissa and Benson? No, I mean, you can first get to know Melissa and Benson as a stranger or my colleague. Of course, Eve nodded. If you want me to approach them now, then I will. Thank you. Klein lowered his head, a slight, somewhat bitter smile on his lips. Suddenly, a strange yet familiar sensation came from within him. Klein's expression froze, and his eyes widened slightly. The potion had been digested. After 2 seconds of stunned silence, the clown's ability activated, flattening Klein's upturned lips. Don't digest it so. He prayed silently in his heart, but even in his mind, he couldn't utter the words. A wave of apology surged, as if a huge pressure was weighing on his heart. Eve lowered her gaze, looking at Klein with a hint of complex emotions in her eyes. How do you plan to approach them? Klein adjusted his top hat. The clown's powerful facial control ability had already restored his expression to normal. Eve pressed her right hand to her lips, her thumb reaching her chin, pinching it repeatedly. How about going back to high school? Klein was momentarily stunned, then said hesitantly, the high school you're talking about isn't Melissa's school, is it? Melissa's school isn't really a high school, is it? Melissa is about to take her university entrance exams. Eve waved her hand and said, so it's somewhat related. You are going to be a teacher. Exactly. Eve said proudly, and a mechanical engineering teacher at that. After speaking, Eve tilted her head slightly, patted her cheek, and said, sigh, if I were still a man, with this setup, I'd definitely be the male lead in a campus romance novel. Then your female lead would be truly pitiful. Klein's tone carried a hint of disdain. Ruarui peeked her small head out of Eve's handbag and nodded in agreement. What do you two mean? Eve grabbed Ruarui's ear, preventing her from burrowing back into the handbag. I'm still very reliable. Just tell me if it's feasible. Eve mumbled. What about your job then? Klein said. Becoming a teacher was indeed a good way to make contact, but he hadn't forgotten that Eve was a journalist. I'll leave a clone in Backland to be a journalist, Eve said. My main body will move to Tingen and become Melissa's teacher. A clone. How convenient, Klein thought enviously. This must be a Beander ability of a high sequence. I wonder if a high sequence of the seer pathway can create clones. But Melissa already has a mechanical engineering teacher. Eve snorted twice, saying nothing. Well, that's not a difficult task for an angel, Klein thought. You must not lead others astray. Klein said with some worry. Don't worry, don't worry. Eve patted her chest, assuring him. Klein lowered his head in thought for a moment, then looked up at Eve and nodded solemnly. All right, Eve slapped the table, I'll go prepare now. As soon as she finished speaking, Eve waved goodbye to Klein and left the room. Forging identities, Eve was a professional. Since the early 5th epoch, she had walked the world in various guises, venturing into multiple fields. What was decided that morning, Eve had already completed by noon, and she could go to class tomorrow. At the school gate, Eve, holding a document bag, slowly walked to the side of the black-haired, brown-eyed girl. Hello, my name is Eve, and I'm the new mechanical engineering teacher." Eve tilted her head and said to Melissa, even shaking the document bag in her arms to show her authenticity. Melissa was stunned for a moment, looking up at the young girl in front of her, her eyes filled with admiration. She had never seen such a beautiful girl. "Hello, my name is Melissa," Melissa said somewhat reservedly. "I know, your grades are very good," Eve continued. "Are you also waiting for the bus here?" Melissa replied softly. Klein had to use a lot of persuasion to convince Melissa to take the bus to and from school. "Where do you live? Perhaps we can go home together," Eve said with a smile. "I live on Narcissus Street." "What a coincidence, so do I." This chapter was revised a bit. After much thought, being a teacher is better. Otherwise, little Klein can't explain why Eve is an elder sister and not a younger sister. Telling the truth would expose the existence of Beyonders. The title seems unchangeable. I've tried several times, but it hasn't changed. Chapter 90, Black Rose. Clip-clop. A series of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, and the public carriage gradually stopped in front of them. Miss Eve smiled at Melissa, lifted her skirt, and boarded the carriage. Melissa froze for 2 seconds, a blush appearing on her face, and she lowered her head, not daring to look at Eve. She awkwardly ran her fingers through her hair, stared at the ground, and stiffly followed Eve onto the carriage. Once inside the carriage, Melissa was immediately taken aback. There was nothing unusual about the carriage, no one noticed an exceptionally beautiful girl joining them. How strange. Melissa looked at the people around her and recalled that it seemed to have been the same when they were waiting for the carriage earlier. No one noticed Teacher Eve. If Teacher Eve hadn't greeted her first, she wouldn't have noticed her either. And with such a beautiful teacher coming, there shouldn't have been no news among the students. Is this what Emperor Rosal meant by low sense of presence? Melissa felt that her previous understanding of Emperor Rosal's famous saying had been too shallow. Miss Eve is so beautiful, why is her sense of presence so low? Melissa thought hard for a while, then shook her head and gave up. It's too profound. Thankfully, my major isn't philosophy. Eve sat quietly in her seat, secretly glanced at Melissa, curved her lips, and said nothing. The wheels turned round and round, rumbling all the way to Narcissus Street. Eve picked up her handbag, and after getting off the carriage with Melissa, she waved goodbye. The girl slowly walked back to her rented house on Narcissus Street, took out various mechanical engineering books, and began to study them. Eve had studied mechanical engineering before, but out of a responsible attitude, she still needed to review it, and what she had learned might be somewhat different from what was current. No. 2 Narcissus Street. After dinner at the Moretti family, Melissa rubbed her somewhat full stomach and opened her mouth, wanting to say something. Hiccup. Melissa immediately covered her mouth, lowering her head, a little embarrassed. Ha ha. Benson chuckled twice. Klein looked at Benson, then at Melissa, and cleared his throat twice. Benson and Melissa's attention was immediately drawn to him. Benson, Melissa, I have 2 pieces of good news to announce. Klein suppressed the corners of his mouth, saying with a serious expression. Logically, one should be smiling when announcing good news, but Klein found that when facing Melissa and Benson, his potion would digest. To slow down the digestion of the potion, Klein could only try not to smile. First, Klein held up a finger. I've been promoted. My weekly salary is now £6. It was actually £10. £6 was the weekly salary of a Nighthawks official member. But his weekly salary had increased too quickly, and he was worried that Melissa and Benson would overthink it, so he hadn't said anything, planning to find an opportunity to tell them later. Really, Klein? Melissa looked at Klein in disbelief, her mouth unconsciously widening slightly. Benson also had an incredulous look on his face. He silently watched Klein, rubbed his head, with a hint of relief in his eyes. Of course, Klein looked at his sister and brother in front of him, trying hard not to smile, and continued in a serious tone, the second good news is that I received a bonus, a full £10. £10. Melissa couldn't believe it, repeating it in a low whisper. Benson unconsciously sat up straighter, his eyes shining as he looked at Klein. After a long while, he took a deep breath, smiled contentedly, his eyes filled with pride. "We can consider hiring a maid," Klein said. "And Melissa?" "Me." Melissa was stunned for a moment, looking at Klein. "Yes," Klein nodded seriously, his eyes full of earnestness, "you should have your own pocket money now." "No," Melissa quickly waved her hand, saying, "I don't need it, Klein. We can save the money." "Klein is right," Benson echoed. "Melissa, you should have your own pocket money now. This isn't a useless expense, Melissa, this is dignity. But, with Klein's current weekly salary, we can already enter the middle class. According to middle class etiquette, you should have your own pocket money," Benson said slowly. "Besides that, we should also hold tea parties. Of course, we don't need to consider that now, but occasionally treating your friends to small cakes and puddings is still necessary." "Really?" Melissa asked, half believing, half doubting. "Of course," Klein immediately said sincerely and seriously. "Although we don't need to strictly follow those etiquettes, basic etiquette must still be observed, otherwise, we will be looked down upon by others. Of course, your pocket money doesn't have to be spent on small cakes, you can also buy mechanical parts you like. In short, this is your pocket money, and you can spend it as you wish." Melissa's heart stirred. Looking at her two serious brothers, she hesitated for a while and finally nodded. Crimson moonlight poured through the window onto the books, and gusts of breeze entered the room, lifting a corner of a page. Eve's hand gently brushed over the paper, flattening the corner of the book, then she closed the book with a thump, and placed it on the tall stack of books. The girl rubbed her eyes, lay down on the desk, and murmured, "Damn Zhou Mingrui, I've sacrificed too much for you." After lying down for a while, Eve sat up and began to study books. After finishing one, she lay down again. After repeating this many times, Eve stood up and walked to the full-length mirror. At this time, the Moretti siblings had already said goodnight to each other and returned to their rooms. Let's go, Eve yawned and said, "This is killing me." "Okay." Klein quickly walked 2 steps to Eve's side. He looked down at him and suddenly asked, "Do you have the monster formula?" "Yes." Eve looked up and said, "What's wrong?" "Old Neil took me to a bar today and we encountered one, or to be precise, half a monster, because his spirituality is very high, so he often sees things he shouldn't see and hears things he shouldn't hear." Klein explained. "I understand," Eve nodded. "Take me to see him tomorrow." "How many potion formulas do you actually know?" Klein couldn't help but ask curiously. Besides all the formulas for the assassin and hunter pathways mastered by the Rose School of Thought, Eve had also displayed the formulas for Wind Blessed, Monster, and the Apothecary Pathway formula from Ruarui. In addition, Eve knew the core of the Seer Pathway's acting method, so Klein guessed that Eve should also know some of the Seer Pathway formulas. Calculating this way, Eve really knew a lot of formulas. "I know all the low-sequence formulas," Eve replied. "All." Klein was shocked. Even low-sequence ones were astonishing. Thinking this way, Eve should know most of the mid and high-sequence potions. "That's amazing," Klein exclaimed, then thought of another question. "Why does the Rose School of Thought only master the complete formulas for Hunter and Assassin? Then do you think the Church of the Night has only mastered those few pathways for over 2,000 years? Eve retorted. Klein pondered for 2 seconds, then shook his head. "If you want to know, then study quickly and catch up." Eve thought of the stack of books on his desk, said through gritted teeth, then placed his hand on Klein's shoulder. "Wait," Klein quickly whispered. Eve lowered his hand and looked at Klein. Klein immediately turned around, faced the full-length mirror, made sure the illusion Eve had cast on him was normal, and then turned back. "Okay, we can go." Eve silently watched Klein's actions, opened his mouth, thought for 2 seconds, and finally closed his mouth. He put his hand on his shoulder and took Klein to Rhodes Islands. After dropping Klein outside, Eve casually entered a tavern. "A glass of Vega beer, please," Eve said, standing at the counter. There were rarely such polite pirates and adventurers, so the owner couldn't help but look up at the person, a hint of amazement flashing in his eyes. He looked around and found that those guys who usually cheered when they saw a beautiful woman had no reaction at all, as if they hadn't seen the woman in front of them. In an instant, the owner had an idea in his mind. Whatever the reason, this woman was definitely not to be easily provoked. He immediately withdrew his gaze and swiftly handed over the drink. Eve took the drink, casually found a seat, placed the drink on the table, and took out a book from his handbag to continue reading. "Boss, a glass of absinthe." A curvy woman with black curly hair walked in with long strides, and the tavern immediately became even noisier. "Yo, Lena, who are you looking for today?" a somewhat sloppy drunkard said, then made a hip-thrusting motion. "Am I good enough?" "You're not good enough, only your dad is." Lena rolled her eyes and said, "Get lost. I'm his dad." A rough voice came, and a burly man missing an ear shouted loudly. The two did not resemble each other in the slightest. "Screw you, I'm your dad." The sloppy drunkard cursed. "Ha ha ha ha," Lena laughed, shaking all over. She took the absinthe from the owner's hand, swirled it twice, and leaned against the counter, saying, "How many more dads does he have?" "Me. And me. Here's another one." Lena took a sip of absinthe, touched her face ecstatically, and thoroughly enjoyed the feeling. Eve looked up at the messy tavern, then lowered his head to continue reading. Eve knew that girl, Lena Medina, who, like Sherman, was a male demoness. For this reason, the two felt a sense of shared misfortune and had an exceptionally good relationship. She was the first mate of the Red Agate, and was known as the Black Rose, at sea, a demoness of pleasure. He had a deeper impression of her because Mickey once described Lena as an ancient demoness of the witch church. Because of this evaluation, Lena had a small reputation within the Rose school of thought. However, they only thought the evaluation was cool and didn't understand its meaning. After Death's fall, Eve's actions were no longer restricted, and he began to spread the idea that the primordial demoness was equal to the chaos demoness on the southern continent. This gained him many followers, although many of them simultaneously worshipped Cheek and Eve. When the time was ripe, Eve began to separate the primordial demoness from Cheek. Under Eve's suppression, Cheek eventually had to abandon the witch church and, with his remaining followers, established Theosophy order. So, the current witch church is equivalent to the Rose school of thought. They do not know that the ancient witch church and the Rose school of thought were in opposition, and that the ancient church was one that worshipped the primordial demoness. Eve's Rose school of thought would not deceive men into taking the assassin pathway, and after Eve's authority suppressed Cheek, he instilled the Beyonder knowledge that Sequence 7 of the assassin pathway will turn into a female, into Sequence 9, so even wild Beyonders would know, greatly reducing the birth of fanatical demonesses. Therefore, it is now rare to see the fanatical demonesses of the former witch church. Pirates, by nature, had a temper for immediate revenge, and with the stimulation of alcohol and the incitement of a beautiful woman, a conflict naturally erupted. The tavern was in chaos. The owner anxiously watched the men fighting. The sound of breaking glass and the sight of damaged tables and chairs in his eyes made his heart ache. These pirates would not compensate him for his losses. Lena held her absinthe, smiling as she enjoyed the farce, seemingly very happy. Eve looked up at the farce, sighed, and invisible spider silks quietly wrapped around everyone. Immediately, the tavern became silent. Everyone remained motionless in their respective poses, as if frozen in time, but the rolling beer bottles on the floor and the heaving chests of the pirates still indicated the passage of time. The owner secretly glanced at Eve, then immediately withdrew his gaze, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead, his breathing trembling. Lena's smile faded. She tried with all her strength to break free but found her body still unable to move. She asked with a serious expression, "Your Excellency, can you tell us the reason?" "We will certainly correct it." Many of the pirates had sobered up a lot. Some began to beg Eve for mercy, while others started cursing loudly. Bang! Smash! Ah! Eve released the spider silks that bound them, and the tavern was immediately filled with crashing sounds and curses. Lena tentatively moved her arm, and after realizing she really could move, immediately said, "Thank you, Your Excellency." At the same time, she pondered in her heart what the Excellency's intentions were. The people in the tavern, after their fright, all ran outside. Suddenly, only Eve, Lena, and the owner were left in the tavern. Lena looked at Eve, a hint of amazement flashing in her eyes, then immediately realized how it was possible that those people in the tavern had no reaction to such a beautiful girl appearing. "Your Excellency," Lena tentatively called out. If they continued, a bloody incident would occur. "Of course, I don't mind if they die, but you would have a lot of trouble," Eve said with a smile, standing up and walking towards the door. "A small lesson, remember to compensate the owner for his losses." Lena nodded. Chapter 91, Admiralsel. The carpet woven from crimson moonlight gently paved the path, yet it couldn't hide the flowing blood. Corpses and fresh blood silently told of the slaughter in this alley. Eve came to the alley where Klein had hunted pirates. Why did so many pirates run out? Klein poked his head out of the alley and asked. He raised his right hand, touched his shoulder, and let out a soft hiss. This hunt wasn't as lucky as the last one. Klein was sure he had bruises all over his body. Fortunately, he had kicked away the opponent's knife at the first opportunity, otherwise, he would have had several more cuts. Nothing, just scared them a bit. Eve squatted down, grabbed a corpse by the shoulder, and threw it into the mirror world. Klein nodded and didn't continue to ask. He didn't have a habit of digging for answers. He took 2 steps forward, came to the short knife, took out his citrine pendulum from his pocket, and suspended it over the knife. This is a Beander item. This is a Beander item. ... This is a Beander item. After silently chanting it 7 times in his mind, the citrine pendulum spun rapidly counterclockwise under Klein's gaze. It wasn't a Beander item. Klein was a bit disappointed. He picked it up, ready to find a place to destroy it. This pirate is a hunter. How about selling the Beander characteristic to me? Eve asked. 1 Beander characteristic is equivalent to 2 main ingredients for a potion. A sequence 9 potions main ingredients are between 50 and 200 pounds. You still owe me 345 pounds, so I'll offer 345 pounds. How about it? Okay. Klein nodded. Beander characteristics couldn't be directly sold at ordinary Beander gatherings. He still hadn't dealt with the sailor Beander characteristic he acquired last time. Since Eve had sealed it in an iron box, he wasn't worried it would fuse with other things. Klein planned to save up some money and then ask an artisan to turn it into a Beander item. Klein unbuttoned his blood-stained jacket and tugged at the white shirt underneath to examine it. The bloodstains were particularly noticeable on the white shirt. He secretly congratulated himself for wearing his old, cheap formal suit. Eve placed her hand on Klein's shoulder and sent him home. Here, take this, Eve said, taking out a bottle of red potion. You can apply it externally or take it internally. Each potion has a different flavor, Eve added. Coconut, strawberry, sweet iced tea, and of course, some little surprises, like fish, raw fish. Raw fish. Klein thought of the potion Ruarui had given him, which was full of fishy smell. And among the potions Ruarui left after the Spawn of Evil God incident, the one Klein drank was mint-flavored. Just like a blind box, Klein thought. He hesitated for a moment, but finally took the potion, held it to his lips, and tilted his head back sharply. The red liquid slid down the bottle into Klein's mouth. Immediately, Klein felt a burning sensation in his mouth, and an earthy taste exploded, as if he had eaten a red chili pepper with wet soil. So terrible. Klein leaned his upper body forward, bent at the waist, and let out a few soft, hiss sounds. The potion was instantly held far away by Klein. Oh, Eve pinched her chin in surprise, it seems you picked a potion with a rather unpleasant flavor. This is too terrible to drink, Klein complained. It's like a red chili pepper covered in mud. Next time, I'll pick it myself. All right, Eve said with a smile. I'm leaving. Good night. Good night. The next morning, to go to school with Melissa, Eve woke up early and waited by the roadside. Melissa walked to the roadside and saw the beautiful teacher, still standing by the roadside as she had yesterday, with little presents. Good morning, Teacher Eve. Good morning, Melissa, Eve said with a smile, looking at the girl. Melissa stood beside Eve somewhat reservedly, waiting for the public carriage. After waiting for a while by the roadside, both girls got into the carriage. Neither of them spoke on the way. Students always have a certain distance and reserve with newly met teachers, and Eve didn't actively try to close the gap, as that would seem too deliberate. After getting off the carriage, the two parted ways. Eve had classes both in the morning and afternoon. The school's teaching staff wasn't very abundant, she taught more than just Melissa's class. After arriving at the office, Eve napped at her desk for a while before going to class. Incarnation of disaster. Master of the mirror world. Symbol of joy and pain. I have a mission today, so I can't go with you to find Admiralsel. It's okay, I can go by myself. Eve silently replied, while still teaching normally on the surface. Ring ring ring. The dismissal bell rang. Eve put down the chalk and took out a handkerchief to wipe her hands. Teacher Eve, I'll help you carry your books. A blond boy immediately stood up, rushed to the podium, and was about to pick up the books on the desk. The other boys, seeing this, gritted their teeth in frustration and silently sat back down. Eve quickly took the books, held them in her arms, and said with a smile, "Thank you, Corbel, but I don't need help." Corbel rubbed his nose and smiled at Eve somewhat awkwardly. Eve walked out of the classroom, holding her books. Teacher. Several boys immediately followed her, rushing to the door but found that Eve's figure had already disappeared. Huh, where's the teacher? The boys scratched their heads, looking left and right but couldn't find any trace of Eve. The Black Dragon Bar. A girl with golden curly hair and an ordinary face walked into the bar. A glass of absinthe. The girl tapped the counter with her fingertip and said to the owner. The owner glanced up, then lowered his head to find the drink, handing the absinthe to Eve's clone. Admiralsel couldn't control his spirit vision. If Eve's main body had come, he would have died from looking directly at her, and it was Eve's lunch break now. Eve looked left and right, then lowered her head and quietly said to the owner, "I want to see Admiralsel." Swain looked up, observing the young girl as if he were judging her. Eve smiled as she looked at Swain. After a while, Swain gestured towards the card room with his chin. "He's in there. Be careful not to cause trouble," Swain said, wiping a glass, without raising his head. His somewhat fierce tone and burly physique gave his words an intimidating aura. Eve smiled. The girl pushed open the wooden door of the card room. There was no one playing cards inside. The somewhat dim room was truly desolate compared to the boxing ring outside. A pale-faced man with greasy hair was crouching in the corner of the room, holding his head, his body trembling slightly, seemingly afraid of something. That should be Admiralsel. Admiralsel didn't notice that someone was walking towards him. Chapter 92, Playing Dead. Eve stood before Admiralsel, openly scrutinizing him. Admiralsel crouched in the corner, clutching his head, his body trembling slightly, the shadows concealing his form and his fear. "You're the monster, aren't you?" Eve asked, crossing her arms and leaning down. The man in work clothes tremblingly raised his head to look at Eve, then, as if startled, collapsed onto the floor, his body rigid. "I have the monster formula. Do you want it?" Eve said with a smile. Admiralsel stared blankly at Eve. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, he slowly nodded. What price do I have to pay?" Admiralsel asked, his voice trembling. As half a monster, Admiralsel could always discern many things about people, but he saw nothing from the woman before him. The price. Eve took a folded piece of paper from her pocket, waved it in front of Admiralsel, and scoffed, "The price is 100 pounds. Eve shook the potion formula, then released it, saying, "Your imagination is quite rich." The formula floated gently in the air and landed in Admiralsel's arms. Admiralsel lowered his head in a daze, looking at the formula in his arms. His lips slowly curved into a smile, growing wider and wider, finally transforming into a burst of ecstasy. The man tightly clutched the formula, as if someone would rush out and snatch it away the next second. "I will pay the gold pounds as soon as possible." Admiralsel clenched the formula tightly, his voice trembling slightly. Eve curved her lips, and with her hands behind her back, said, I will return here at 7 in the evening, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after, or even half a year from now. I hope you can pay the price the next time we meet. Goodbye. Eve pushed open the door and turned back to Admiralsel, who was slumped on the floor. Admiralsel watched Eve leave, clutching the formula tightly, his breathing heavy as if he couldn't catch his breath. 2 seconds later, a regretful Admiralsel immediately rushed over, flung open the door, but the golden-haired girl was no longer in sight. At school, Eve went to class with her books after lunch break. Eve could go home after class, but to ride home with Melissa, Eve sat in the office for a few more hours. Does Melissa really like machinery? Eve tilted her head and leaned closer to Melissa, asking in the carriage. Melissa clutched a mechanical part in her hand and softly hummed in affirmation. I have some interesting small machines at home. Would Melissa like to see them? Eve said with a smile. May I? Melissa's eyes lit up as she asked with some anticipation. Of course. Melissa followed Eve off the carriage and into her home. The room was simple, clean, and tidy, but showed no obvious signs of anyone living there. The overall layout of this room should be the same as No. 2 Narcissus Street. Upon entering the house, one would find the living room. The living room contained a long sofa and a single-seater sofa, with a glass coffee table in front of them. 5 porcelain white cups were inverted on the tabletop. To the right of the sofas and coffee table was a square dining table, beside which stood a reddish-brown wooden shelf. The top layer held 3 bottles of red wine, while the middle contained various sundries. The bottom layer, and the one that most attracted Melissa, held only a mechanical clock. A reddish-brown wooden casing protected the clock face, with a circular brass pendulum hanging below. However, a closer look revealed a winding mechanism hidden behind it. This was actually a music box. Melissa reached out, unable to resist wanting to touch it. She curled her fingers twice, then turned her head to look at Eve, her eyes filled with longing and expectation. Teacher Eve, may I touch it? Melissa asked. Of course. Eve smiled and raised her hand, making a please gesture. Thanks to Rosal, the gestures from her previous life were now understood by people. Thank you, teacher. Melissa said happily, reaching out to touch the winding mechanism behind the music box. It felt slightly cool to the touch, as if to help dispel the summer heat, which Melissa greatly enjoyed. The girl reached for the winding mechanism and twisted it twice, but found that the music box did not activate. There was no music and no movement. The music box is broken, Melissa immediately thought. A tingling sensation rose in her heart, wanting to dismantle it, see its internal structure, and then repair it, but she couldn't. This was Teacher Eve's music box. She remembered the pocket money Klein gave her, 1 sower each week. After buying a small cake, she still had a lot left. She could save up and buy her own music box. Oh. Eve walked over to Melissa, saying with some surprise, is it broken? It should be. Melissa twisted the music box's winding mechanism twice more, but still no sound came out. Let's take it apart and see. Eve pointed at the music box, telling Melissa. Okay. Melissa's tone held a hint of pleasure and anticipation. Seeming to feel this was inappropriate, the girl cleared her throat twice, reined in her smile, and put on a serious expression. She carried the music box to the dining table and began to dismantle it. Before long, the music box's casing was opened, revealing the mechanical mechanism inside. Eve slightly turned her body to look at Melissa. Melissa had her hands braced on the tabletop, her brows slightly furrowed, intently staring at the mechanism before her, searching for the root of the problem. The structure of this music box was not overly complex, but Melissa had never encountered a music box before and needed to explore it bit by bit, which took quite some time. Incarnation of disaster. Master of the mirror world. Symbol of joy and pain. Incarnation of disaster. Master of the mirror world. Symbol of joy and pain. Prayer after prayer suddenly burst into Eve's ears, urgent and panicked. Zhou Mingrui. Eve immediately turned her gaze to Klein. Klein looked in horror at the suddenly reanimated corpse, frantically chanting Eve's honored name, while immediately reaching for the holster under his armpit and drawing his revolver. Bang, bang, bang. After 3 gunshots, the corpse still tightly gripped his wrist, not even letting out a cry of pain, as if those 3 bullets were just a game. Enchantment. I need enchanted bullets, Klein immediately thought, fiercely pulling the trigger, again and again. The last shot in the revolver was an enchanted bullet. Bang! The bullet pierced the shoulder of the clown's corpse in the tailcoat, blood splattering from the wound. The clown immediately began to sway slightly, his body unsteady, as if he would faint the next second, but he still desperately clutched Klein's wrist. Honorius, Flegre, Honorius. Chapter 93 The Wolf That Eats Seers. Eve withdrew her gaze. That corpse wasn't dangerous, Klein could handle it perfectly with his abilities. He was just startled. He raised a hand and gently rubbed his temples, then lowered his eyes to look at Melissa. Is Teacher Eve tired? Melissa asked immediately, putting down the music box in her hand, seeing Eve gently rub her temples. No, Eve said, lowering her hand. Melissa glanced at the clock on the wall, pondered for 2 seconds, and said, my brother should be home by now. I need to go back. Okay, Eve said, holding up the music box with both hands, extending her arms forward, and offering it to Melissa. If you like it, you can borrow it. You can return it tomorrow or the day after. Thank you, Melissa said, placing one hand on the music box and gently pushing it back, while waving her other hand. No need, I don't really need it. She simply enjoyed the process of disassembling the music box, studying its internal structure, and then reassembling it. Hearing this, Eve nodded and put the music box back on the shelf. Goodbye, teacher. Goodbye. Eve took 2 quick steps to open the door, stepped aside to let Melissa pass, and stood at the doorway watching her leave. Meow. A black cat jumped down from the windowsill. You still remember to come back, Eve complained, turning her head. He glanced inside the room. Ruarui looked lazy, sprawled on the carpet washing his face. Come here, let's go have dinner. No need, meow, I've already eaten, Ruarui explained, narrowing his eyes and purring. Sherman took me to a literary salon. A literary salon, Eve retorted, that wasn't for eating, was it? I'm just a cat, meow. Ruarui opened his eyes, adjusted his posture, tucking all 4 paws beneath him. Do you expect me to discuss Rosal's literary achievements with them, meow? All right, Eve said, a hint of sadness on his face, pressing his chest. It seems only an old person like me will have to spend dinner alone. Ruarui rolled his eyes at Eve in an undignified manner. The girl chuckled twice and went out alone for dinner. When Eve returned home, the crimson moonlight already bathed the streets. He sat at his desk, lit the gas lamp, and pulled out a mechanic's book from a tall stack of books. His fingertip glided along the side of the book, paused, and his nail sank slightly into the pages as he lifted it, turning to the last page he had read. The girl propped her face with her right hand, reading sideways. 2 minutes later, she switched to propping her face with her left hand. After a while, she switched back again, changing positions several times. 10 minutes later, Eve picked up the tea set on the desk, poured himself a cup of water, and silently sighed in his heart, why can't I get rid of these bad habits? When studying, he always wanted to slack off, especially at home. He would drink water or eat a biscuit after 2 seconds of studying. These were Eve's bad habits from his previous life. Some of his bad habits from his previous life had not changed in this life, and he didn't plan to change them. Eve tilted his head back, drank the water in the teacup in one gulp, then put down the teacup and thought to himself, study, study. Ruarui had already jumped onto the bed, his entire body curled up under the covers. It was rare for him to come home so early, and he didn't even bother with Eve. It was past 11 at night. The Moretti siblings had already said goodnight to each other and retired to their respective rooms. Eve walked out of the dressing mirror and entered Klein's room. Hi, Zhou Mingrui, Eve waved, speaking like an old friend reunited after a long time. How have you been lately? Klein really wanted to roll his eyes at Eve, but that was too ungentlemanly. However, thinking that he didn't really need to be a gentleman in front of his old sister, he ultimately did roll his eyes. You clearly know, Klein couldn't help but rub his forehead, his tone tinged with helplessness. I'm going to have psychological trauma. What exactly is on Hornassus Peak? Klein couldn't help but ask. During his advancement, he heard, Hornassus. Phlegre, from the corpse's mouth, he also heard, Hornassus. Phlegre, and when helping people with divination at the Seer Club, he directly saw a palace. All of this made him extremely curious about Hornassus Peak. On that distant Hornassus Peak, there is a wolf that eats seers. Eve's voice was extremely soft, his lowered tone blending with the crimson moonlight, carrying a hint of eeriness. Whatever it doesn't finish, it hangs from the rafters as cured meat, for reserve rations. Klein's mouth twitched, and he silently looked at Eve. What you're saying is like, children who don't sleep will be taken by wolves. Klein's expression was a little downcast. He missed his parents a bit, he never used to be like this when he was out. Klein subconsciously tried to grip his cane but grabbed nothing. He nonchalantly released his hand and said, the difference is that what you're saying should have some credibility. That wolf must be a high sequence of the seer pathway. Eating seers made him think of Beander characteristics. It should be eating the Beander characteristics of the seer pathway. Speaking of which, does that wolf eat people? Klein imagined a house full of hanging people. No, if they were made into cured meat, would those people still have human form? What hung in that room would be? Klein gasped, startled by his own imagination. Of course not, Eve said, that wolf doesn't eat people. Klein breathed a sigh of relief, looked up at Eve, and retorted, be careful, someone might sue you for defamation. Don't worry, Eve waved his hand, his eyes showing a complex emotion, it can't sue. It. Klein keenly caught the it. It seemed that wolf was also an angel. He wasn't surprised. Compared to a clumsy Sequence 7 colleague having an angel inside him, an unreliable angel old sister having an angel acquaintance, no, an old wolf, seemed perfectly normal and reasonable. Are you still going to Rhodes Islands tonight? Eve asked. Of course, Klein nodded. Although the psychological trauma hadn't disappeared, he still needed to earn gold pounds. After I get this bounty, I can hire an artisan to create a Beander item. Artisan. Eve stroked his chin, pondering, have you considered having Melissa take the Savant pathway? She's very suitable for a Savant and could gain some self-preservation abilities. If she could become an artisan, she could earn a considerable income. Klein immediately shook his head. He didn't want Melissa to come into contact with the dangerous Beander world. But considerable income. Klein shook his head internally, dismissing the idea. An artisan is Sequence 6. By the time Melissa becomes an artisan, the civil servant system would probably already be implemented, and Benson would have a stable and substantial income by then. Eve shook his head indifferently. He had only asked casually. Then let's go. Eve placed his hand on Klein's shoulder, and in an instant, the world transformed into an oil painting. Chapter 94 Viscount Glaint. Klein looked at the richly colored world, as if countless colors flowed, merging and separating. But I still need to remind you, Eve's slightly ethereal voice echoed in Klein's ears, Melissa's fate shows that she will become a savant in the future. Perhaps if you didn't have such thoughts, you wouldn't have this fate. Klein glanced down at Eve and said speechlessly. The rich colors rippled like water, transforming into a neat and normal appearance, and Eve brought Klein back to reality, saying softly, fate is not that easy to change. She turned to Klein, patted his shoulder, and said, I'll wait for you at the tavern. Klein nodded and left alone, his black trench coat blending with the night. Klein never wore his expensive formal attire when hunting pirates. It was not only inconvenient for movement and conspicuous but also extremely painful if damaged. The first time he wore a cheap suit, which Eve's illusion disguised as a sailor uniform. After receiving his bounty, Klein bought himself a black trench coat suitable for movement. Eve walked into the tavern from last night. The girl wasn't there today, perhaps she had already left, or perhaps she was scared, but she didn't mind. She ordered a drink as usual and waited in the tavern for Klein to finish his hunt. About half an hour later, Eve left the tavern and returned home with Klein. Do I get to choose this time? Eve placed the red potions on the floor, about 10 bottles, occupying only a small area of the floor. Klein nodded, staring intently at the potions on the ground. After a moment of hesitation, he placed his right hand on the potion closest to him, picked it up, observed it carefully twice, then put it down, picked up an adjacent bottle, held it with both hands, rotated it twice, and after careful observation, opened the stopper and sniffed at the mouth of the bottle. It had no scent, just like water. It seems impossible to distinguish them by appearance and smell alone, Klein mused, placing the potion in his hand on the desk. This is my choice, Klein said in the mysterious tone he used at the Seer Club. Eve crossed her arms, watching Klein with interest. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Why aren't you drinking it yet? It's for external application, please step aside. Klein placed his right hand at his side, making a, please, gesture. Eve was silent for 2 seconds, then slowly raised her right hand and extended her middle finger. It's a pity you're not a provoker, otherwise half the Beander potion would be digested. Eve put down her hand, walked to the full-length mirror, turned back, and said, then stepped into the mirror. After Eve left, Klein took off his trench coat and shirt, placed them on the bed, picked up the potion from the desk, and poured it onto his wound. The cool potion immediately dispelled the pain from the wound, bringing a refreshing sensation. Sunlight filtered through Backlund's morning mist, spilling into the bedroom. The beautiful girl on the bed's eyelashes trembled twice, and she opened her eyes, which held a hint of haziness. Sherman closed her eyes again, raised her arm, and pressed it over her eyes, blocking the dazzling sunlight. 2 minutes later, the girl rolled over, snuggled into her fiancé's embrace, and raised her hand to touch Jessica Edwin's beard, her movements cautious, afraid of waking him. Sherman loved touching Jessica's beard. The short beard brushed against her palm, a little prickly but not painful. Good morning, sweetheart. Jessica rolled over, embraced Sherman, and said in a muffled voice with his eyes closed. A blush immediately spread across the girl's fair face. After their engagement, Jessica always called her, baby, or, sweetheart. Good morning, Jessica, did I wake you? Sherman leaned into the man's embrace, her face full of tenderness, and said, no. Jessica paused for a second before saying, if I say, yes, can I get compensation? A blush immediately rose on Sherman's face. She glared at Jessica, sat up, pulled out the pillow from behind her, threw it at her fiancé, and said coquettishly, you're really not a standard Loan gentleman. Perhaps Intis would suit you better. No, that's not right, you did live in Intis. I wonder how many women you've said those things to, things you learned from those Intis men. Sherman, somewhat annoyed, raised the pillow and gently hit Jessica's face, then threw the pillow down in exasperation and climbed out of bed. Hurry up and get up, Sherman urged, we still have a banquet to attend, we must prepare in advance. Nobles and the wealthy always enjoyed holding banquets, which allowed them to flaunt their wealth and status, as well as expand their social connections. Sherman, arm in arm with her fiancé, entered the banquet venue. As soon as the girl appeared, she attracted everyone's attention. Her beautiful and delicate appearance made people unable to help but fall for her. Sherman was long accustomed to this situation. After becoming a witch, her appearance and charm greatly improved, and after becoming a demoness of pleasure, they improved even further. Her beauty was not the absolute top tier, but due to the characteristics of a demoness, Sherman always attracted others' attention greatly. Many gazes lingered on Sherman for a while before gradually dispersing, but Sherman could still feel several gazes consistently fixed on her, and some gazes occasionally looked at her and then shifted away. The girl, arm in arm with her fiancé, entered the banquet venue. Led by Jessica, Sherman greeted each of the sirs and madams. Sherman, Jessica, a beautiful brown-haired woman holding a glass of red wine, greeted the two. It's lovely to see you both here. I didn't expect you to be here as well. It's a pleasure to see you. Jessica raised her glass in return. Miss Furs, I'm so happy for you. Your Wuthering Heights achieved excellent results, it's simply wonderful. Thank you, Furs said with a smile, but her eyes glanced at Sherman. Jessica smiled knowingly. It seems you two need some time and space alone. He gently kissed Sherman's forehead. I'll wait for you by the dining table. Sherman nodded, watching Jessica leave. After Jessica left, Sherman immediately took 2 steps forward and asked, has Viscount Glaint arrived? Furs nodded, her expression somewhat serious, took a deep breath, and reassured her, he arrived at the gathering quite early and is currently resting alone. Don't worry, we will definitely rescue Zhou. Having said that, Furs made a triangle gesture on her chest, silently praying in her heart. In fact, Sherman was very confident about rescuing Zhou, but she didn't say anything, merely nodded silently, took 2 steps forward, and took Furs's arm. Zhou was Sherman's best friend, the only person who didn't mock her when she was a man, so after successfully becoming a woman, Sherman, who hadn't even told her family, revealed the truth to Zhou. Furs led Sherman to Viscount Glaint's location. Hello, Mr. Viscount. Furs, holding a glass of red wine, saluted Viscount Glaint. The corners of her mouth curved upwards, her tone carrying a hint of laziness, and she leaned in slightly to whisper, I hear you're very interested in mysticism. Viscount Glaint looked at the 2 ladies in front of him, his gaze lingering on them for a moment before naturally retracting. He nodded slightly and said, yes, may I ask who you 2 ladies are? Furs Wall, an author. Furs paused for a few seconds, opened her mouth, and chuckled softly, and also a true Beander. Viscount Glaint was taken aback. He put down his red wine glass and looked at the 2, is that so? It seems we need to prove it, Sherman said with a muffled laugh. She extended her hand in front of Viscount Glaint, and with a whoosh, an illusory black flame burned fiercely in Sherman's hand. Viscount Glaint immediately stood up, his eyes fixed on the black flame in Sherman's hand. This is definitely not a trick. After seeing that Viscount Glaint believed them, Furs and Sherman exchanged glances, and Furs immediately stepped forward and said, Mr. Glaint, we need to talk with you. What do you need? Viscount Glaint asked hesitantly. He knew that for Beanders, obtaining money was not difficult. Perhaps they wanted a certain Beander material from his treasury. Do you need any materials? No, not at all, Sherman shook her head, we would like to ask for your help. In return, we will bring you into the Beander world. I need some time to consider, Viscount Glaint said. Could something that Beanders couldn't accomplish be very dangerous? We await your reply, but please be swift, Furs said, this is not a dangerous matter, at least not for you. Chapter 95, Sacrifice and Bestowal. Inside an ordinary house, Sherop sat in a chair, opened a bottle of expensive red wine, and without using a glass, tilted his head back and poured it directly into his mouth. Knock, knock. A knocking sound echoed, and Sherop frowned, feeling a bit annoyed. He ignored the knocking, hoping the person outside would quickly and consciously leave, not disturbing his wonderful morning. It's better not to drink in the morning. A familiar voice came from outside the door, startling Sherop, whose hand twitched, spilling red wine onto his clothes. He immediately stood up and hurried to the door to open it for the woman outside. Miss Eve, Sherop said respectfully, your arrival makes my humble house appear exceptionally glorious. Eve waved her hand, not wanting to hear such words. In truth, Sherop wasn't being obsequious, he was simply filled with reverence for this mysterious woman who had appeared in his life since his birth. Her appearance, unchanged for decades, made Sherop clearly aware that she was a high-sequence Beander he could not afford to offend. Even her unparalleled beauty did not stir any ill intentions in him. Please craft a Beander item, Eve said, taking out an iron box containing a sailor characteristic and handing it to Sherop. Inside is a sailor characteristic. For the Beander item's ability, I require something related to defense, and it should interfere as little as possible with combat on land. Among the artisans who had collaborated with Eve, the most outstanding was naturally Rosal Gustav, but unfortunately, he could no longer craft Beander items for her. After Rosal's demise, the one who crafted low-sequence Beander items for Eve was Shar, and later, Shar's direct descendants. Shar was a pitiful child. Mediocrity was not a sin, but he was a Gustav. Eve stood by his bedside when he passed away. She told him, "I have the ability to extend your lifespan." But Shar merely smiled, shook his head, and departed from the world. Death is an inevitable end, but perhaps this is a good thing. Sherip respectfully took the box from Eve's hand, agreeing repeatedly. Eve tilted her head and glanced at Sherip, saying nothing, and silently departed. Sherip did not try to keep her, nor were there any pleasantries or formalities. This was how they had always interacted. There was little conversation, and even the name, Eve, he had learned from his father. Eve returned directly to her home in Tingen. Today was Sunday, there was no school, and Klein was going with Benson and Melissa to hire a maid. There was also a dinner party tonight, so today's mysticism class was cancelled, and Eve had a rare holiday. Everything at the mausoleum was proceeding smoothly. Many mirror creatures had already entered the mausoleum. Eve peered into the interior of the mausoleum through the prayer light spots. She had already met Cheek. Cheek's condition was very poor. She was severely wounded after instigating the Pale disaster with the Underworld Emperor back then, and then Eve seized the opportunity to steal her faith and hunt her down. She still hadn't fully recovered. It will probably take another 2 or 3 months for the mausoleum to be fully completed. To successfully obtain the Loan royal family's share of the Conqueror characteristic, Eve did not take action. Taking the Conqueror characteristic from Cheek is much simpler than taking it from the royal family. After a routine check, Eve withdrew her gaze, flopped onto the soft bed, pulled out Wuthering Heights from under her pillow, and prepared to enjoy her holiday. Eve read until evening, only taking a few sips of sweet iced tea for dinner, and was about to go to bed. But as soon as she lay down, she heard a prayer. Incarnation of disaster. Master of the mirror world. Symbol of joy and pain. Immediately after, Klein asked in Loan, Wandering Spirit, true creator's kin, whose honored name is the eye that gazes upon fate. Eve sat up and replied, Ouroboros. Ouroboroses. Klein was a bit surprised and hesitated for a moment whether to report Hazener's matter to the captain. After 2 seconds of thought, Klein still felt it was better to report it. From this matter, Hazener was clearly dangerous, and this matter wouldn't affect Ouroboros at all. How did you know this honored name? Melissa's classmates played mirror divination at the dinner party, Klein said. They used this honored name. What a daring group of children, Eve exclaimed. To quote Emperor Rosal, newborn calves are not afraid of tigers. Klein was speechless for a moment, feeling some sympathy for Emperor Rosal. Tell them about the sacrifice and bestowal ritual at tomorrow's Tarot Club meeting, Eve suddenly said. You've been promoted now, so you can perform the sacrifice and bestowal ritual. Klein nodded. Should I try it out beforehand? If you're not confident, you can try it. If it succeeds, you can deliver packages, Eve suddenly added. Klein choked for a moment, unable to speak. Although he did have such thoughts, this was clearly a grand sacrifice and bestowal, altar, mystical symbols, spiritual materials, honored name, and prayer words, Eve listed one by one. The process for a normal sacrifice and bestowal ritual is very complex, but since you're still in the startup phase, let's keep it simple. The startup phase seems fine too, Klein mused inwardly, but he still felt something was off. He hadn't intended to start a business, he just wanted to set up a platform. A simple altar, with mystical symbols drawn on it. Your mystical symbol is that pattern composed of the eyeless eye and twisted lines. Then, arrange candles using the binary method, and use a language that can communicate with Beyonder powers, such as giant language or ancient Hermes, to recite the prayer words and honored name, Eve explained in detail. How about it? Still very simple, right? Klein raised his cane and gently tapped his palm, silently reciting it a few times in his mind, making sure he remembered it before nodding. He pulled a silver pocket watch engraved with vine patterns from his coat pocket to check the time. 2:52 a.m. Klein took a deep breath, looked straight ahead, filled with a heroic sense of facing death, and ascended Saphira Castle by walking 4 steps backward. It was time for the weekly embarrassing moment again, Klein thought with a touch of melancholy. Klein suspected that his old sister had recorded all of his awkward moments, but there was no evidence. No, that's not right, it's better if there's no evidence, he wouldn't want any evidence to exist. Eve followed closely behind, also ascending Saphira Castle. Huge pillars supported the palace. Inside the magnificent, ancient bronze palace, a man and a woman sat on chairs. Eve leaned against the bronze armchair, looking languid, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest of the chair, waiting for the gathering to begin. Chapter 96 New Diary. Red light surged, piercing through the dense gray fog. In the ancient, magnificent bronze palace, the red light receded, revealing a man and a woman. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool, Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Eve. Audrey rose, curtsied elegantly with a graceful sweep of her skirt. Alger and Eve followed closely, exchanging greetings. This time I only collected one page of Rosal's diary. Audrey recalled the content of Rosal's diary in her mind, expressing her thoughts vividly, and dense, unfamiliar symbols immediately appeared like flying mosquitoes on the white paper. Mr. Fool. Klein waved his hand, and Rosal's diary immediately flew into his hand. I'm very sorry, Alger said with a slight bow. I've been at sea and haven't approached land, so I haven't found any new Rosal's diary. Klein nodded, not overly concerned. Indeed, as he expected, subsequent Rosal's diary entries were much fewer. Seeing that the fool did not blame him, Alger quietly breathed a sigh of relief. He secretly observed for a moment and found that the fool did not seem to care much about Rosal's diary. Rosal's diary had some use to the fool, but not much, Alger mused, which perfectly aligned with his imagination of a high-level existence. He covertly glanced at Eve, his brow furrowing then immediately relaxing. Eve still hadn't given Rosal's diary to the fool. Alger rested his chin on his hands, controlling his body language to prevent Justice from noticing anything unusual, and pondered the reason in secret. Eve also didn't have Rosal's diary last time. A glint flashed in Alger's eyes, which made him increasingly believe that Eve belonged to the fool's faction. Klein was unaware of Alger's brainstorming. He picked up Rosal's diary with a feigned air of profundity and began to read. July 9th, I suddenly thought of an interesting question. Since the sequence pathway is also called God's grace, God's pathway, who exactly was blasphemed? And who created the blasphemy slate? Why can it control all sequence pathways? What else is recorded on it? I really want to see it. Blasphemy slate, Klein recalled even the captain's past words. Based on the information he currently knew, he deduced that what was blasphemed should be the gods. After all, the gods' pathway could truly lead to godhood. July 12th, I learned a fact today. July 14th, I met that mysterious Mr. Zeratul again. He is actually the leader of the ancient Hermetic order. Eve is actually the leader of the Rose School of Thought, which is even older than the Hermetic order. As expected of my golden finger. The leaders of two secret organizations. Indeed, I am the protagonist of this era. Klein's fingers lightly tapped the armrest, a rhythmic beat. He was not surprised by this news. Although old sister hadn't explicitly told him that Zeratul was the leader of the Hermetic order, based on the knowledge old sister taught and the information from the Church of the Night, Klein had speculated that the Zeratul family had a deep connection with the Hermetic order. Klein withdrew his thoughts and continued reading the diary. After I became a savant, Mr. Zeratul said that I had chosen a path that was destined to be arduous but relatively safe in the early stages. He told me his sequence 9 was seer. Surprisingly, he also told me that Eve's pathway's sequence 9 was assassin. So cool. If only I had met Eve before becoming a Beander, then I could have become an assassin. Ah, I wonder what the great emperor's reaction would be if he knew that the assassin sequence 7 was which. Klein thought with some curiosity. I was very curious about the relationship between this Mr. Zeratul and Eve, but Mr. Zeratul only said one sentence, my ancestor and she had a very good relationship. So what? So what? What's your relationship with Eve? Your ancestor had a good relationship with Eve, what about you? I deliberately scoffed, saying, is every seer like this, saying half and hiding half, never explaining things clearly? And he's clearly a high-sequence Beander, he doesn't need to act as a seer anymore. That Mr. Zeratul, the Antigonus family's relic. Clearly, this matter can only be possible once I become a core member of the Church of the Artisan God. In low sequence, the fastest even only needs 1 month. 1 month. No wonder old sister was so surprised. This Mr. Zeratul's information needs to be updated. Now the fastest record is half a month. I continued to ask, he smiled without speaking. To hell with smiling without speaking. When I become a high-sequence Beander, I'll beat up every seer I see. Audrey looked towards the fool, obscured by the gray fog, wondering curiously about the content of Emperor Rosal's diary. I've kept you waiting. The fool's leisurely voice suddenly rang out, and Audrey quickly snapped back, almost losing her spectator state. It is our honor. She mused for a moment, organizing her words. I apologize, Mr. Hanged Man, I haven't found the 6 crystallized feathers of the Blue Shadow Falcon, but I have already written to my brother, entrusting him to help search. Perhaps I can give them to you next week. The Hanged Man nodded. He had just advanced and was not in a hurry to find the materials. Audrey glanced at the gathering members, deliberated for 2 seconds, then said, I would like to know clues related to the psychology alchemists. Although she didn't want to join a secret organization right now, she still needed to contact members of the psychology alchemists to obtain subsequent spectator formulas. After all, good luck couldn't last forever, and she might not encounter the formula she wanted at the gathering again. Eve glanced at Alger, and after confirming he had no intention of speaking, she said, the psychology alchemists are more loosely organized than other secret organizations. Most of their members are psychiatrists or psychology enthusiasts. Miss Justice can try to contact these people, you might find a psychology alchemists member. Loose. Audrey blinked, asking curiously, why are the psychology alchemists more loosely organized than other secret organizations? Miss Justice looked intently at Eve, but unfortunately, the gray fog obscured too much information for her to observe. I will pay for this knowledge. I don't know much, Eve mused for a moment, glancing at the Hanged Man opposite, and asked, do we need to communicate privately? No. Audrey followed Eve's gaze to Alger and shook her head. Eve leaned back, half reclining against the backrest, and after deliberating for 2 seconds, she said, the psychology alchemists was originally a study group of psychology enthusiasts, but they fortunately obtained the treasure left by Hermes, mastering the spectator pathway, and gradually developed into a secret organization. It is a secret organization that emerged in the last 200 years. Hermes. Audrey's eyes widened slightly, almost losing her spectator state. Was Mr. Hermes also a Beander? A high-sequence spectator? Alger also couldn't help but widen his eyes, looking at Eve. The historically famous Hermes. I'm very sorry, I don't know, Eve spread her hands, indicating her helplessness. Perhaps this Mr. Hermes is not the Mr. Hermes we are familiar with. Audrey lowered her head somewhat disappointed, puffing out her cheeks in a deflated manner, then immediately reacted and quickly restrained her actions, glancing left and right. After confirming that no one had noticed her movements, she calmly entered the spectator state, as if nothing had happened. I am very satisfied with this knowledge. Audrey sat upright in the bronze chair, hands clasped on her lap, observing Alger carefully for 2 seconds. After confirming he had no intention of adding anything, she opened her mouth and asked, what payment do I need to make for this knowledge? An agate peacock egg. Eve adjusted her sitting posture, but the value of that knowledge is not enough to exchange for an agate peacock egg, so I will pay extra compensation, either knowledge or materials. If I can, I will do my best to help Miss Justice accomplish it. Audrey nodded, thinking about what other knowledge she needed. In fact, she had many questions, such as knowledge of other secret organizations, but after deliberating for 2 seconds, Audrey decided not to ask, saving this payment for later use. How should I give you the agate peacock egg? Audrey asked. Perhaps we can try something. A deep voice came from the head of the long table. Chapter 97, Sacrifice. Alger's expression hardened. He subconsciously wanted to look at the fool but forcibly suppressed the action, subtly shifting his gaze to the Empress. Eve noticed the hanged man's gaze, slightly curved her lips, and looked back. The hanged man was momentarily stunned. He silently withdrew his gaze, focusing his attention on the long table in front of him. Audrey secretly observed everyone's reactions, taking in all their interactions. After Mr. Fool proposed the attempt, Mr. Hanged Man's chin lifted slightly as he subtly looked at Miss Empress, but there was an imperceptible pause in his movement before looking at the Empress. He wanted to observe Mr. Fool, but he immediately abandoned that idea and then turned to observe Miss Empress instead. Miss Empress looked at Mr. Hanged Man. Did she discover that Mr. Hanged Man was observing her? How perceptive. I wonder what pathway of Beander Miss Empress is. Audrey observed and analyzed the drama like a rational spectator, her emerald eyes fixed on the two of them. Mr. Hanged Man seemed a bit afraid and resistant to the fool's attempt, but Miss Empress was much more composed. Am I the only one looking forward to it? Audrey looked at the two of them, thinking silently to herself. As one of the earliest members of the Tarot Club, she clearly knew how miraculous the attempt Mr. Fool spoke of would be. It's just a small attempt, Klein said in a deep voice, crossing his hands and resting them on his chin. You need to try 2 rituals, sacrifice and bestowal. Alger's pupils contracted. He tried hard to suppress the fear in his heart, lowering his head to avoid showing any abnormality. As an official Beander, Alger naturally understood these rituals. After the 5th epoch, Orthodox deities rarely responded to similar rituals, so, sacrifice was often associated with devils and evil gods. Devils, evil gods, Alger tried to calm his breathing. He felt that he was now walking on the edge of the abyss, slowly moving closer to its center. At first, it could only pull people into this mysterious space, then it could respond to prayers, and now it could accept sacrifices. The fool's influence on reality was growing stronger and stronger. Miss Justice can sacrifice an agate peacock egg to me, and then I can bestow it upon Miss Empress. This form of transaction is beneficial to both of us. Audrey gasped, covering her mouth, immediately breaking out of her spectator state. It can actually be done this way, she exclaimed in her heart, feeling that it exceeded her imagination. The young girl was stunned for 2 seconds before slowly emerging from her dazed state, realizing the advantages and the divine essence hidden beneath the ritual. Our tarot club is truly amazing, Audrey thought excitedly. It's completely different from ordinary secret organizations. We use divine methods to exchange resources and materials, divine methods. No, that's not right, praise Mr. Fool. Alger, on the other hand, became even more vigilant. He restrained his body movements, and only after ensuring there were no abnormalities did he stand up and respectfully ask, Respected Mr. Fool, what do we need to do? First, prepare an altar. The altar must be inscribed or drawn with this symbolic pattern. As soon as Klein finished speaking, a light screen appeared before them. On the screen was a mysterious pattern composed of the eyeless eye, symbolizing secrecy, and the distorted lines, symbolizing change. It was the fool's mystical symbol. Originally, Klein wanted to say that the altar could be simple, but Old Sister said that it would not be conducive to maintaining the image of a deity, so he dropped the idea. Actually, this act of delivering packages itself is not very divine, Klein complained in his heart. Which deity acts as a delivery person for their believers? No, they are not my believers. Thinking about it that way, it's a bit pathetic. Klein shook off the random thoughts in his head, maintained his serious expression, and continued, if you forget, you can pray to me. Secondly, follow the normal procedure but there's no need to choose a specific date. Just chant my name. Thinking of this, Klein's thoughts couldn't help but wander again. In this step, there were many procedures to please deities, such as burning herbs and anointing with holy oil. Could these actions truly please a deity? Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man's prayer rituals also included these steps to please deities, but he felt nothing. Perhaps it's because I'm not a true deity. Klein had originally wanted to delete these steps, but Eve adamantly insisted on keeping them. Deities must maintain distance from their believers, this is conducive to the spread of faith. Although the Hanged Man and Justice were not Klein's believers, Eve was certain that in the future, even if they didn't convert, they would definitely be loyal to Klein. After all, they were not devout believers, and Klein could not only provide them with emotional value but also more substantial help. Klein collected his thoughts and continued, "Chant my name in ancient Hermes, giant language, or Elvish, accompanied by the prayer, your loyal servant, Dor." After the chanting, combine the spiritual materials with the natural power fluctuations caused by the incantation, and await my response. Alger's expression grew even more solemn. He guessed that the fool might be in a predicament, gradually breaking free from his shackles, and one day would descend into reality. He might want to use us for something, Alger pondered in his heart, but he couldn't think of what kind of thing, especially since he clearly had a knowledgeable and powerful subordinate. There might be some secret here, the Hanged Man speculated in his heart. The sacrifice requires an accurate time. Klein tapped the armrest and asked in a deep voice, "When does Miss Justice plan to attempt it?" Although Klein had removed the specific date, the sacrifice still required an accurate time. This was because the sacrificial passage could only exist for a short period, so he had to prepare in advance. "I wonder if true deities are like this," Klein muttered in his heart. For true deities, are specific dates a requirement or a decoration? Audrey paused, tilted her head, and pondered for 2 seconds. "I need some time to find the agate peacock egg. Once I find it, I will confirm the sacrifice time with you through prayer. Is that acceptable?" Klein nodded. Audrey immediately brightened, continuing to ask, "Respected Mr. Fool, what is the bestowal ritual like?" Klein opened his mouth and continued in a deep voice, "The bestowal ritual is very similar to the sacrifice ritual." Chapter 98, The Erased Truth. Klein completely recounted the bestowal ritual. Audrey silently memorized the ritual content, thinking with a slight excitement, "Praise Mr. Fool." Alger looked left and right. Seeing that neither Justice nor the Queen intended to speak, he took the initiative and said, "I heard that a listener from the Aurora Order is searching for traces of the true Creator, which they call their sanctuary." "The true Creator?" Audrey asked, somewhat confused. "An ancient existence, worshipped by many secret organizations and hidden cults. They believe that the Creator has not completely perished, and the true Creator is the core of his remnants." Alger roughly explained the situation of the true Creator. Since the 5th epoch, the true Creator has appeared in various forms, such as the Hanged Giant, and the Eye behind the curtain of shadows. As he spoke, Alger's gaze shifted to the Queen, hoping that this spokesperson would say something meaningful. Alger did not want to offend the fool, and given a choice, he would never directly probe the fool. Eve looked at Alger with a profound gaze, then opened her mouth and added, "During the Solomon Empire era, the true Creator was an orthodox deity." Klein did not expect Eve to reveal such a secret history directly. He leaned back against the chair, observing their reactions with a relaxed posture, wondering if he should add fuel to the fire. He tapped the armrest lightly, recalling Eve's description of the Hanged Man pathway, then opened his mouth and said with a hint of a smile, "I prefer to call him the fallen Creator." Eve nodded, looked at Klein, then withdrew her gaze and leaned back. Alger suddenly felt his heart clench tightly, his pupils constricted, and for a moment, he forgot to breathe. A hidden excitement and sense of superiority arose spontaneously, making his brain abnormally excited. Secrets between deities. The Hanged Man's Adam's apple bobbed. His hands were tightly clenched, veins protruding on the back of his hands, and his eyes revealed both fear and excitement. Audrey tightly covered her mouth. This completely overturned her understanding. An orthodox deity could actually become an evil god. This was simply unbelievable. Why? Audrey's voice trembled slightly, barely maintaining her spectator state. Why did the true Creator transform from an orthodox god into an evil god? Perhaps you will know in the future. Eve did not answer directly. Alger and Audrey's expressions both tensed. Alger had now emerged from that feeling of excitement, quickly regaining his usual calm, and began to analyze the useful information. The history of the 4th epoch was severely lacking. Most information came from the Church's scriptures, but there was no record in the scriptures of the true Creator being an orthodox God in the fourth epoch. Alger subtly glanced at the fool. He had never seen any information about the fool in any records. The Queen was very knowledgeable about the fourth epoch, which meant the fool must have been active in the fourth epoch. Could the fool be an existence similar to the true Creator, an existence erased by the scriptures? And erased more thoroughly, to the point where even his existence was wiped out? Was it because the fool was sealed, unable to affect reality, so his existence was directly erased? If that were the case, he should be an existence opposed to the Church, Alger thought with some concern. And the fallen Creator, or the true Creator and the Creator really connected? But in the Book of Storms, Alger crossed his hands, resting his chin on them, not daring to think further. Audrey didn't think that much, but she also considered the possible antagonistic relationship between the fool and the Church. Klein sat at the head, taking in the expressions of all three. He tapped the table twice, drawing everyone's attention. I have no conflict of interest with the seven deities, the fool said in a deep voice. The surrounding mist gathered around the fool, completely obscuring his form, making him mysterious and inscrutable. That voice echoed in Alger's mind, giving him a feeling of being seen through. Mr. Fool, your description is indeed more appropriate. According to our observations, among Beyonders who believe in the true Creator, no, the fallen Creator, the proportion of those who lose control is far higher than the normal value, and most of the rest are lunatics. Alger said with a hint of a smile. This was both danger and opportunity, he judged silently. The Nighthawk's internal files had also mentioned this. He had asked his old sister about it at the time, but Eve had only vaguely said it was related to the true Creator. Klein analyzed in his mind, the matter of the true Creator definitely involves many secrets between deities. This is truly incredible, Audrey said in surprise. Miss Queen, Mr. Hanged Man, could you elaborate on the various secret cults and mysterious organizations? I rarely get to encounter them normally. I will pay for the information. Alger turned to look at the Queen. After waiting a few seconds and confirming she had no intention of speaking, he nodded. No need to pay. Consider it payment for the 6 crystalline feathers of the blue shadow falcon. The Hanged Man cleared his throat twice, glancing at the Queen and saying, I don't know much. If there are any inaccuracies, please point them out, Miss Queen. Eve curved her lips, nodding slightly, not bothered by his little cleverness. Alger pondered his words for 2 seconds before speaking. Let's start with the Rose School of Thought. It and the Moses Ascetic Order were the earliest secret organizations, although some believe the earliest secret organizations were the Church of the Night, the God of Combat's Church, and the Earth Mother's Church. At this point, Alger subtly looked at the Queen, but unfortunately, the Queen merely rested her chin on one hand, listening quietly without any special reaction, much less any intention of adding anything. Klein was surprised for a moment. The Church of the Night was once a secret organization. Audrey puffed out her cheeks, muttering in rebuttal, those people must be members of the Church of Storms, the Eternal Blazing Sun Church, or the God of Knowledge and Wisdom's Church, right, Miss Queen? Eve looked up at Audrey, her lips moving a few times, then said, some claims are true, some are false, but facts are facts. Why can't she be clearer? Audrey grumbled in her heart, lowering her head to the table in front of her in exasperation. Alger frowned, not understanding what this meant, whether the rumors were true or false. He sighed in his heart, both dissatisfied with the Queen's enigmatic answers and secretly resentful of how little he knew. The Hanged Man pulled his thoughts back, adjusted his state, and continued, the Rose School of Thought has existed since the fourth epoch. It originated in the northern continent but has greater influence in the southern continent. They established the Witch Church in the southern continent, worshipping an ancient existence named the Chaos Demoness, also known as the Primordial Demoness. It once had the right to openly preach in several countries on the northern continent, but after the era of Emperor Rosal, it was suppressed and lost its right to openly preach. There are rumors that this was because the Rose School of Thought supported Emperor Rosal in launching a war. Klein was startled, then quickly used his clown ability to mask his momentary lapse. The church and deities are not entirely consistent. I wonder what role old sister played at that time. Klein lowered his eyes, lost in thought. 2 seconds later, he stopped thinking. These are too far removed from me, Klein thought silently with downcast eyes. No need to think about them. Eve looked up at Klein, her eyes showing neither joy nor sorrow. 2 seconds later, she withdrew her gaze. I know these things, Audrey thought to herself. After all, it was a faith that once openly preached in LotM and is now popular in the southern continent, so she knew a bit. But she hadn't heard that rumor. Alger glanced at the queen. Seeing that she still had no intention of speaking, he continued, the Sequence 9S controlled by the Rose School of Thought are assassin and hunter, and most of its members are female. It's worth mentioning a secret organization called the Theosophy Order. This is a very secretive organization, and I know very little about it. All of its members are female, and the existence they worship is called the primordial demoness. Audrey looked at the hanged man with shining eyes. And they are extremely hostile towards the Rose School of Thought. Audrey was stunned. Why? Don't they worship the same deity? Klein also couldn't help but perk up his ears. Eve had not told him any of this. No, to be precise, they believe they are not. The Theosophy Order believes that the primordial demoness is not the chaos demoness. Alger shook his head and explained. How strange. Audrey muttered in her heart. The Rose School of Thought's conduct is better than many secret organizations, they haven't engaged in blood sacrifices or massacres. However, they frequently clash with the Orthodox churches and other secret organizations. You're trying to take over their territory, of course there will be conflicts. Klein thought silently to himself. Chapter 99, The Sun. Why does Theosophy Order believe that Chaos Demoness is not Primordial Demoness? Audrey asked curiously, maintaining her spectator state. I don't know, but there are rumors that Theosophy Order broke away from the Witch Church. As he spoke, Alger frequently looked at Empress, but to his disappointment, Empress seemed oblivious and remained silent. The hanged man suppressed his disappointment and continued to explain knowledge about secret organizations. Klein maintained the leisurely posture of the fool and listened attentively. Much of the knowledge Alger explained, Klein already knew, and even knew more, but there were still some points that required attention. For instance, the beliefs in Chaos Demoness on the northern continent and southern continent had many differences. Before Emperor Rosal opened the sea route to the southern continent, the belief in Chaos Demoness on the northern continent did not include the Primordial Demoness. Because the belief in Chaos Demoness existed on both the northern continent and southern continent, many historians and geographers speculated that during the Fourth Epoch, the northern continent and southern continent were connected, and at that time, the belief in Chaos Demoness on both continents should have been the same. Differences began to emerge after the northern continent and southern continent became separated. Klein suppressed the urge to tap the armrest. Originally, he designed this action only to cover the act of switching on and off his spirit vision, but he didn't expect it to truly become a habit. Eve rarely spoke to him about herself, and Klein did not have the habit of prying or actively asking, so Klein's understanding of the Rose School of Thought was actually less than his understanding of other secret organizations. Additionally, there was the Hermetic Order. Every action of the Hermetic Order seemed to be in pursuit of something. Klein recalled Zaratul's cooperation with Rosal in Rosal's diary, and also the Antigonus family notebook incident. Are they pursuing the Antigonus family? Klein wondered in his heart. After the three exchanged a bit more, Klein disbanded the gathering. Above the gray fog, Klein's expression was solemn, his gaze focused on Eve. Eve looked up, smiling as she looked back at him. You. Klein's lips moved a few times, but nothing came out as he opened and closed his mouth. A silence fell over the gray fog. In the silence, Klein rubbed his forehead in distress, but his body accidentally touched a star, and a faint voice appeared in his ear. Great God, please look upon this land again. Please, save us, save my parents. This is a cry for help. Klein was startled and immediately extended his spirituality to touch that star. A blurry image instantly appeared before his eyes. He could vaguely see a boy with brownish-yellow hair kneeling, praying to a crystal ball. How strange. The style of the boy's clothes was something Klein had never seen before. It was neither the current popular fashion nor the traditional attire of countries like Loan, Fulsak, or Intis. Moreover, the boy was using the giant language. Klein listened intently and generally understood what had happened. He turned to Eve, pointed at the star, and said, "Someone is asking for help." As he spoke, a light screen appeared before Eve, displaying the scene Klein had seen to her. Eve looked at the light screen before her, slowly reining in her smile, and with a serious expression, nodded slightly to Klein, "Pull him up." Klein turned his head, his spirituality extending into the star, pulling the boy up to Saphira Castle. Derek prayed to the crystal ball again and again, for the faint hope in his heart, his hands clasped, kneeling before the crystal ball. Just as his heart was slowly slipping into despair, the crystal ball suddenly erupted in a deep red light, engulfing him. When he opened his eyes again, Derek found himself in a completely unfamiliar environment. A magnificent, ancient bronze palace, surrounded by illusory grayish-white mist. Before him was an ancient and mottled bronze long table, and beside the long table sat two figures shrouded in thick fog. A spark of hope ignited in Derek's heart. Are you a god?" Derek asked, confused and at a loss. As soon as he spoke, he immediately lowered his head, not daring to look directly at the two figures before him. "One must not look directly at God. You can call me the fool, and this is the Empress." No denial, truly a god. Derek's heart trembled with excitement, his body shaking slightly, and he knelt directly on the ground, his hands clasped tightly, pleading, "Great God, please save us, please look upon this land again. I pray for all the people of Silver City to break free from the curse of fate. I pray for the sun to appear in the sky as described in those books. If possible, I also hope you save my parents. I am willing to offer my body, my soul, and everything I possess, begging for your gaze." Derek's voice trembled slightly, carrying obvious fear, but it was exceptionally firm, without the slightest intention of backing down. Klein was startled by Derek's sudden kneeling. Although kneeling during prayer was normal, it still made Klein particularly awkward. If not for the clown's ability, the fool's gravitas would have been lost. The fool secretly took a deep breath, composed himself, and then began to analyze the information from the boy's words. Praying for God to look upon this land. What does that mean? Is the place he is in not looked upon by God? Could it be the legendary Forsaken Land of the Gods? A crisp tapping sound echoed in the empty palace. Derek heard the sound and instinctively wanted to look up. His head barely lifted a bit before he immediately lowered it again, suppressing his desire to look up. A soft female voice spoke. "Why should we help you? Mr. Fool is not interested in mortal bodies and souls." The small flame that had just ignited in Derek's heart was suddenly doused with a bucket of water, leaving only a few sparks. Eve gave Klein a look, and Klein immediately understood, saying leisurely, "I can give you a chance. I like equivalent exchange. You can use everything you can obtain to get what you want from me, or from others similar to you. Be aware, the value must be equivalent. This can make you strong. Perhaps one day, you can rely on yourself to lead Silver City out of the curse and find the sun. One playing the good cop, one playing the bad cop, this trick always works well." Derek listened quietly, his head bowed in silence. After a while, he opened his mouth and said, "I want to save my parents. They are severely injured, and if they can't be healed." The boy whimpered, unable to continue. "Yes," the fool said in a deep voice, "I will bestow upon you the healing medicine." Derek felt his mind go blank. He couldn't hear, see, or think at the moment, remaining in a dazed prayer posture. This state seemed to last for a long time, or perhaps only an instant. Thoughts began to emerge in the boy's mind. Father and mother can live. This thought domineeringly occupied his entire mind. Klein waited for a while, and only after the boy had recovered did he explain the ritual of sacrifice and bestowal. "What do I need to pay?" Derek asked with a hint of reverence in his voice. "I am fond of long histories. The exchange I seek is the history of Silver City. I have established a gathering here, which you can join. You can deliver the knowledge at the next gathering, or, after receiving the medicine, choose a time when you are alone to deliver the knowledge through prayer. Derek did not hesitate and immediately said, I am willing to join. Then, draw your codename. Klein waved his hand, and a deck of tarot cards appeared before Derek. 22 major arcana cards were laid out before Derek. The Fool waved his hand, and 4 cards flew out from the 22 cards: the Fool, the Empress, the Hanged Man, and Justice. Derek took 2 steps forward and flipped through the tarot cards. The text on the tarot cards had all been translated into giant language by Klein, and Derek could understand them all. Without any hesitation, Derek said firmly, the sun, I choose the sun. Chapter 100, Forsaken Land of the Gods. Sun, huh? The Fool chuckled, his tone ethereal and unpredictable, exuding the characteristic, divine charlatan, aura of a seer. Great deity. Derek opened his mouth. I choose to deliver the knowledge after receiving your grace, and I will perform the ritual immediately after leaving. The Fool nodded. You may call me, the Fool. Derek was stunned for a moment, then lowered his head and said, yes, Mr. Fool. Eve glanced at Klein, her lips moving a few times, and began to explain Klein's prayer ritual and the general information about the tarot club to Derek. After a while, Klein saw that they had talked enough and said, I will notify you before the gathering begins. Find an uninhabited place within 1,000 heartbeats time, wait there, and I will pull you in here. Klein guessed that the sun might be from the forsaken land of the gods, and that his time might be different from his own, so it was safer to notify him himself. Yes. Klein cut off his connection with Derek and sent him back. Congratulations, Eve leaned back, half reclining on the bronze chair. You've conned another member. Conned. How can divine matters be called conning, even if this deity is fake? Klein muttered in his heart, refuting. He looked at the crimson star in front of him, then at Eve below him, thinking about Eve's performance in front of Derek, and half-jokingly said, you think, will he mistakenly believe you are my blessed? After all, in Derek's eyes, the Empress was very respectful of the Fool, and could communicate with the Fool alone. Communicating with a deity alone, in the eyes of ordinary people, is a privilege only for the blessed. Perhaps, Eve said indifferently. Although they wouldn't dare to ask directly, after spending a long time together, they will inevitably see some things. Klein leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Perhaps later they will think you are my blessed. What's wrong with that? I wouldn't mind. Eve waved her hand and said indifferently, in the tarot club, I position myself as a blessed. But in my positioning, I should be my blessed. I mind very much, Klein immediately said. A fake deity brother has a true deity old sister blessed, don't you think there are too many plot holes? As he spoke, an illusory door slowly formed in front of them. Klein immediately got up and took out the potion hidden behind the bronze chair. It was what had been sent up when they experimented with the ritual. He used his spirituality to push open the door of sacrifice and sent the potion in. After doing all this, Klein sat back down. Perhaps we can reveal a little about the relationship between the Fool and the Chaos Demoness to them, Eve suggested. Then, with a little guidance, they might guess that I was placed in the tarot club by the Chaos Demoness. If you then place another blessed into the tarot club, the identity of the Chaos Demoness's blessed will be directly confirmed. The number of seats in the tarot club is fixed. If 2 Fools, blessed are pulled into the tarot club at the same time, it will cause a waste of resources, as one blessed can represent all blessed at the tarot club, and even one seat can be used by all blessed. Blessed. Where do I have a blessed? Klein complained. Others don't know, but don't you? As for revealing the relationship. Klein rested his chin, looking at Eve. What relationship? Siblings. Of course, there's nothing to hide about that, Eve shrugged. Even if we don't say it now, it will be revealed later. Later. Are you plotting something I don't know about? Klein looked at Eve suspiciously, his face full of distrust. Don't you trust your old sister? Eve said proudly, of course there is such a thing. Klein broke into a cold sweat, wondering what that fellow was so proud of. Inside the narrow, dim wooden house, a faint lamplight covered the simple wooden bed, creating a safe zone. Father, mother. Derek stood by the bed, clutching the potion in his hand, looking down at his parents lying on the bed. The boy's hand caressed the smooth bottle. He hesitated for 2 seconds, then finally took a deep breath and leaned down to feed the potion to his parents. His heart pounded heavily, again and again. Derek couldn't help but hold his breath as he nervously watched his parents. A groan sounded, and the intense itchiness from the healing wounds made Derek's parents suddenly awaken. Streaks of lightning flashed, and the pale electric light illuminated the room, then quickly dissipated. The room flickered between light and dark, with only the candlelight continuously providing light and safety. Father, mother. Seeing his parents wake up, tears immediately welled up in his eyes. Derek raised his arm and wiped his face, wiping away the tears, his voice trembling slightly, asking with a hint of expectation, "Father, mother, how are you? Do you feel any better?" Mr. and Mrs. Berg turned their heads with difficulty, looking at Derek. Derek's father's lips moved a few times, and he said in a weak voice, "My wound is itching, you." He glanced out of the corner of his eye at the transparent container in Derek's hand. A few drops of transparent blood-red liquid still remained at the bottom of the bottle. Derek noticed his father's gaze and then reacted, subconsciously immediately hiding the bottle behind him. "Ah, this is." The boy awkwardly took the bottle out again, clutching the neck of the bottle tightly with both hands. "It's me." The boy was not good at lying. He looked at his parents in a panic, stammering for a long time but saying nothing. Derek's father stared intently at his son in front of him. After a long time, he opened his mouth and said, "Is it medicine found in the ruins of other city-states?" "Ah, yes, yes." Derek's mother slowly turned her head, looking at the ceiling, tears quietly sliding from the corners of her eyes, running down her cheeks and into her hair. The surrounding ruins had long been thoroughly explored. How could a good medicine suddenly be found? She understood her son. Derek must have done something unspeakable, but she couldn't blame Derek. "Derek." Father struggled to reach his hand out from under the quilt, raising his hand as if to touch Derek. The boy immediately bent down at the sight. Derek's father placed his hand on his son's hand and patted it lightly twice. His severe injuries prevented him from exerting much strength. His pat was exceptionally light yet carried a hint of power. "Derek, never betray the city of silver." Derek looked blankly at his parents, slowly bent down, and pressed his forehead against his father's hand. "I will never betray the city of silver." For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.